Okay, everybody. Sorry about that. Had an issue with Rumble. Not sure what happened. I set up my whole live stream ahead of time, like a day ahead of time, so that I know that I'm good. And for some reason, it just dropped my live stream. Maybe it didn't. Maybe it didn't think I started soon enough. Hopefully, it's working now. Let's try it again. There we go. All right. Goodness sakes. What a go that was. So, welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm so sorry I'm late. I'm not generally late. Um, if you're here, give me a hello. If you're in the Rumble, on the Rumble channel or on the Rumble app, give me a hello in the live chat section so I know you're here. Hello, hello. And I'm going to pop one in there just so I know the live chat's working. And it seems to be okay. All right. And hi, Brian. Welcome to my folks over on YouTube and Facebook and Twitter. If you're watching from Twitter or YouTube or Facebook, give me a hello and I'll kind of know you're there. We have been out of commission for a while. Um, I have I have one kidney. Pope smokes. Um, I have one kidney stone left. Um, so it's been it's been hell. If you've never had kidney stones, I'm glad for you because they're terrible. So I had one, and that one actually resolved just in a day or two. That one was pretty quick. And I thought, all right, that wasn't so bad. I got through it, didn't need any meds. I mean, other than the stuff that they give you to help, like I can't remember the name of it, to relax the ureter so that the kidney stone will go through. Um, that was all I was taking, and I did okay. And then I learned I had two more, and those were not good. So the one on the left is gone, but the one on the right it's really close. Once they get like to the outlet of the bladder to just above that, then they usually drop pretty quick. But this one's being stubborn, so we'll see. We'll see how I do. If I suddenly have to get off here because I'm in excruciating pain, you'll know why. But so far this morning, things are quiet. So we're reading The Return of the Gods by Jonathan Cahn, and we are on chapter 40. Can you believe we've gotten that far? And I think we only have 52. So we'll see if we finish it today. We may not. We'll just see how I feel. Um, but anyway, I hope you guys are doing well. Made it over to Rumble. Good morning, Miss Debbie. Let me clean my glasses here. I can't see anything. My grandkids were out here. We had a camp out in the camper. Um, we had them over. We had them Sunday night. So Friday night I was miserable. I think I wasn't feeling well Thursday night either. And then that stone dropped beautifully Sunday morning. Thank you. And then we had the grandkids Sunday night, and that was fun. We took them to the park and took them to this great park here in town that our oldest son later informed us just a few weeks earlier, two men had been arrested trying to kidnap a 7-year-old. And this is like a beautiful brand new park in our area. It's really cool. It's got a climbing thing that is a dulcimer, and so there's tones on it. When you climb, you have to really climb hard to get it, but it was a cool idea. Then they've got this hill that's got like indoor outdoor carpeting on it, and you could sled down it, and it's really steep. And of course I did that because I'm me, and I screamed all the way to the bottom, and it was pretty funny. But the kids love that. And then they've got a creek that has several different waterfalls in it that are just little short waterfalls that the kids can play in, and sinks, like wooden countertops set up with sinks in them and pans and stuff for them to play with the rocks. It was great. What was really cool was the 4-year-old enjoyed it just as much as the almost 11-year-old, which is that's a hard gap to plan entertainment for. But they really, really liked it. And then we stayed over here in the camper, which is always big fun. Um, and Atlas was very cute. He's 5. He's gonna be 6, but he's 5, and he said, "Oh my goodness, you have a potty in your big car." Like, I know, isn't that great? But anyway, it was a good time. We took the kids to the batting cages. Only Cole could bat, but Don and he had some batting practice while we watched, and that was fun. And then we went and had pizza. So just a real fun time. I don't get all four grandkids I don't get all 4 grandkids very often because my daughter lives about almost 6 hours away. So it was fun. But anyway, let's get started. We're on chapter 14 or chapter 40, The Dance of the Goddess. One of the strangest concepts in the lore of the goddess is summed up in the phrase, the dance of Ishtar. The strange thing about it is what it signified: war and destruction. It was a peculiar juxtaposition, the image of a dancing goddess against a backdrop of carnage, death, and devastation. An ancient inscription invokes the concept. Fiery glow that blazes against the enemy who wreaks destruction on the fierce, dancing one, Ishtar, who masses the multitude. The Dance of Ishtar. On the opening night of the Stonewall riots, a strange thing happened. So if you're new to this, where we left off last time was the Stonewall riots. Good morning, Susan. Good morning, PJ. The Stonewall riots were riots that took place in New York after the police raided a gay bar. And this was, I want to say, in the 60s. If you guys remember, pop that in there, because that's been a couple weeks ago for us now. But that's where they're back to on the Stonewall riots. On the opening night of the Stonewall riots, a strange thing happened. In the midst of the uprising, fighting, several of those involved began performing a dance. It was a bizarre convergence of music and dance performance on one hand, violence and destruction on the other hand. It was the dance of Ishtar. In ancient Mesopotamia, it was not only the goddess who bore the title of the dancing one. Her priest, the Asinu, were also known for their dances. So in the midst of the Stonewall uprising, Ishtar's modern-day Asinu performed a dance. It was also the ministry of the ancient Asinu to sing the goddess's sacred songs. So those who danced at Stonewall also sang a song. As the ancient Asinu would sing their songs in the female dialect, as if they were women, so their modern counterparts at Stonewall likewise sang their song and danced as if they were women. Lovely locks, joy girls, and harlots. I wonder where he gets these. I'm like, wow, that's a little subheading there. When Ishtar stood on the city wall and called down curses on Gilgamesh, she summoned her female ministers that they might share in her anguish. 3 different kinds of women are mentioned in the account. One translation renders them as the cultic women of lovely locks, joy girls, and harlots. All 3 were associated with prostitution. The first of the 3 mentioned was known in the original language as the Khazertu. The Khazertu were closely joined to Ishtar. The goddess's home city, Uruk, was known as the city of Khazertu. They served in Ishtar's temples, and aside from their association with prostitution, the Khazertu were known for making music. An ancient Sumerian tablet speaks of a girl who acted like a Khazertu, sang songs, and played games. The Khazertu, one writer observes, would be involved in a variety of tasks, including singing, playing instruments, and dancing. The Khazertu, they who wear their hair in curls. Another writer notes of the Khazertu, the women have distinctive hairdos, sing songs, and dance in cultic performances. Accordingly, the Khazertu were especially ordained to sing the songs and dance the dances of Ishtar. As for their distinctive hairdos, the reason the earlier cited translation rendered the Khazertu as the lovely locks is because of the word Khazertu itself. Khazertu comes from the root word khazeru, which means to curl one's hair. So Khazertu most specifically translates to and speaks of the women of Ishtar's cult who wore their hair in curls. The dancing girls. On the opening night of the Stonewall riots, accompanying the goddess's manifestation was the manifestation of the Khazertu. In some translations of the Epic of Gilgamesh, Ishtar's summoning of the Khazertu is rendered this way: Ishtar called together her people, the dancing and singing girls. Her dancing and singing girls is another translation of Khazertu. On the night of Stonewall, the goddess again called together her dancing and singing girls. Those engaged in the dance had no idea, but it was as if the spirit of the Khazertu had taken them over. They were men, but now they became as women, dancing women, singing girls. Their song was a lewd taunt of the police officers, but the lyrics were most significant. They began, "We are the Stonewall girls." And then came the words that stretched back to the Akkadian of ancient Mesopotamia, and to the goddess they sang, "We wear our hair in curls." In the Akkadian tongue, it was equivalent to saying, "We are the Kazertu." And so it was that on the night of Stonewall, with the return of the goddess, the Kazertu, the dancing girls who wore their hair in curls also returned. And as the dance of Ishtar went on, the crowd was driven into a frenzy. It was now that the riot became so dangerous that the police retreated and barricaded themselves inside the bar. At the spirit, I think that's supposed to be as that spirit of the goddess grew even more furious. The elements of the ancient mystery were converging. The dance of the goddess was coalescing with battle and destruction. I shall smash the door. The goddess and her people were locked out of Stonewall, but this was the goddess who refused to be kept out of any realm because of a closed gate or locked door. Her ancient inscriptions described her threats to bring violence against the gates and doors that would not open to her. If you do not open the gate for me to come in, I shall smash the door and shatter the bolt. I shall smash the doorpost and overturn the doors. The goddess had come to the gate of America. Now she would smash in the door. Possessed by her spirit, the mob began pounding and pummeling the bar's front doors, attempting to shatter, smash, and break it open to get to the police officers inside. Stonewall was her dwelling place, her eshdem. She would not be locked out. Eshdem, if you guys remember, means tavern. Hold on, pop up a couple of these, make sure I got everybody in there. Lady of Fire. Ishtar was also the goddess of fire. An ancient hymn celebrates her use of the element to bring destruction in battle. Raining blazing fire down upon the land, lady who rides upon a beast, destroyer of the foreign lands, you confer strength on the storm. Their great gateways are set afire. So now, inflamed by the Lady of Fire, the crowd attempted to light the bar on fire with the police inside. Does this sound familiar to you guys? Does this remind you of anything from our recent, hold on, I gotta turn this fan off, our recent history of burning down buildings with police inside? They squirted lighter fluid through the opening in the doorway and threw burning pieces of garbage, lighted projectiles, and firebombs toward the police officers. They doused the front door with the lighter fluid and set it on fire as well. One eyewitness summed up the intent of the mob with 4 simple words: they wanted to kill. Some would consider it strange that such things as made up Stonewall would from that day forward be celebrated throughout the world, but even that goes back to the ancient mystery. The goddess's works of fire, destruction, and fury were likewise celebrated by her worshippers and lauded in her hymns. Signs of the goddess. That night, the signs of the goddess converged upon each other. The gate, the eshdem, the stone wall, the prostitutes, the cross-dressers, the homeless, the revived Asinu, the lion's head, the raging avatar named Storme, the arresting, the call to help and its response, the Kazertu, the dance of the goddess, the battle, the smashing of the door, the employing of fire, the fury, and the storm. The goddess had returned. The door she had violently pounded that night appeared only to be that of a bar, but was the door of a civilization that had been closed to her. She had now forced it open. She would not rest or cease from her pounding until all the doors of Western civilization were likewise forced to open to her. And with the door open, the other gods and spirits cast out in ancient times would likewise return. We have seen how the place of the explosion and of the goddess's return, the city, the ground, and the very site of Stonewall were all determined by the ancient mystery. It had to happen where it happened. But what about its timing? Beyond where it happened, could there be an ancient mystery that determined when it happened? In other words, did it happen when it had to happen? Could the timing of the explosion at Stonewall have been determined by an ancient mystery involving the moon, the sun, the ancient calendar of Babylon, and the casting of an incantation? Chapter 41. The Moon, the Sun, and the Spell. Could the timing of the explosion at Stonewall have been determined by a mystery from ages past involving the moon, the sun, the ancient calendar of Babylon, and the casting of an incantation? The time of passion and anguish. Ishtar's love was the shepherd Tammuz. One day Tammuz offended her. The goddess set a horde of demons upon him. He tried to flee, but they caught up with him and brought him down to the land of the dead. After his departure, the goddess, in remorse, began mourning him. Her sorrow and anguish were so great that nature itself stopped bearing life. Her maidens mourned with her. Finally, she descended to the land of the dead and brought him back to the world of the living, where he could dwell for part of the year before returning to the dead. When were the days of Ishtar's mourning and anguish? They were days of summer. It was then that the Middle Eastern earth dried up and the leaves and fruit withered away, the sign of Tammuz's death and the separation of the two lovers. The days of Tammuz. But it was more specific than that. The days of Ishtar's sorrow fell within a specific month. The month was so closely connected to the goddess and her cult that it bore the name of her lover. It was the month of Tammuz. The month of Tammuz was especially joined to the mythological realm. It marked the capture of the goddess's lover, his death, his descent, and dwelling in the land of the dead. It was the month when the two gods were separated from each other. For the goddess, it was the month of unfulfilled longings, unanswered passions, and desires denied. It was the month of the goddess's sorrow, her longings and desires, her frustrations, tears, and anguish. When did Stonewall take place? It happened in the ancient month of Tammuz. It was all part of the mystery of the gods that what happened at Stonewall took place in the ancient month of Tammuz. It was no accident that Ishtar's return should take place in the month named after her lover, and so deeply interwoven with her worship. Nor was it an accident that the replaying of her mythology at Stonewall should happen in the month most saturated with her mythology. If the frustration and anguish that exploded into Stonewall were driven by the spirit of the goddess, then it is all the more striking that it happened during the very days devoted to her anguish and frustration. She was separated from and denied the object of her desires. The month's very name, Tammuz, stood for the denied object of her desires. So the days of the Stonewall were the days of Tammuz, and the uprising was likewise born of frustration and the denial of desire. The descending of the sun. In 1969, the month of Tammuz commenced on June 17th, 11 days from Stonewall. One of the most important days on the calendar of the gods and the pagan world was that of the summer solstice, when the sun begins its annual descent. It was a time of rituals, worship, and sacrifices. The summer solstice was one of the most highly charged times of the pagan year, and in the case of Ishtar, the sun's descent paralleled the descent of her lover Tammuz into the underworld. In 1969, the sun began its annual descent on June 21st. It was just days before the events that would set everything in motion, and exactly 7 days to Stonewall. Daughter of the moon and the 15th day. Ishtar was strongly connected to the moon. In several of her mythologies, her father is identified as the moon god. She herself was known as the first daughter of the moon. Since the Mesopotamian and Middle Eastern calendars were lunar-based, each month began with the new moon, which reached its fullness around the 15th day, the month's center point, the day of its full moon. In the Babylonian world, it was a holy day called the Shabbatu. Ishtar was called she of the 15th day, the mother of the month. In 1969, the month of Tammuz, the month of Ishtar's passion, came to its full moon on the weekend that began on June 27th and ended on June 29th. It was the weekend of Stonewall. The riots began just before the full moon and continued just after it. The Stonewall riots centered on the full moon and the center point of Tammuz. It was no accident that the movement that would alter the lines of sexuality and gender was birthed in the month named after the lover of the goddess, who altered the lines of sexuality and gender. And the days of that birth would cluster around the full moon of that month. The separation of man and woman. Tammuz was the month of the separation of Tammuz and Ishtar, the month that separated the male and the female. Thus, the movement that would promote a sexuality in which male was separated from female and female separated from male was born in the month that separated the male from the female and the female from the male. The movement would advance and celebrate the turning of men away from women and the turning of women away from men. The spell. The day that sealed Stonewall and all that would come from it was June 26, 1969. It was then that the Deputy Police Inspector Seymour Pine obtained search warrant number 578. That was the definitive act that would set in motion the raid that would spark the riots, the uprising, and then the movement. It was in that one act that everything was sealed. When was it? When was the warrant issued and the event that would become Stonewall sealed? On the ancient Mesopotamian and biblical calendar, it took place on the 10th day of the month of Tammuz. Is there any significance to that day? There is. An ancient Babylonian text reveals it. The 10th of Tammuz is the day given to perform the spell to cause a man to love a man. So the day that would seal Stonewall and launch the movement that would come of it was not only one of the days of Tammuz and Ishtar, but the specific day ordained from ancient times to cast a spell to make a man love a man. The month of Tammuz, the full moon, the summer solstice, the separation of male and female, the days of frustration and anguish, and the day of the ancient spell to cause a man to love a man had all come together in the summer of 1969 to prepare the way for Goddess and to ignite an explosion. Good morning, List 90. You were waiting for this to go live, but for some reason it just now posts, so I missed the beginning. I'm so sorry. Sometimes you have to refresh a couple times because it'll go live and it won't refresh. And I don't know why that is. I noticed it on other channels. It was the beginning. What happened at Stonewall would rapidly begin radiating into the surrounding culture, sparking a movement and then a metamorphosis. It would act as a catalyst to the overturning of Christian civilization, of biblical morality, and the near universal standards that had undergirded most civilizations for most of recorded history. It would bring that which had inhabited the shadows into the mainstream and then into dominion. But behind the metamorphosis, its spectacles, its signs and symbols, landmarks and seminal events, its celebrations, rites, and sacraments were mysteries of ancient origins. Behind them all were the gods. Those are the mysteries we will now uncover. We begin with the festal processions of Sumer and the gates of Babylon. Part 9, Dominion. Well, let me get the page right here. The wall having, Chapter 42, Processions of the Gods. The wall having been broken, the gate having been forced open, what happened at Stonewall would now begin radiating from Greenwich Village to the world. I stumble on that one every time. The people of Sumer parade before you. In ancient times, the goddess stood at the center of culture and the pinnacle of its religion. She would seek to do so again. She would begin transforming the rage and violence of Stonewall into a movement. And as her ancient cult involved sacred events and annual commemoration, observances, and festivals, she would now turn the Stonewall uprising into a sacred event to be religiously commemorated annually with its own rituals, observances, and festivals. In the ancient Middle East, she was especially known as the goddess of the parades and processions. The ancient hymn, "The Holy One," begins, The people of Sumer parade before you. They play the sweet Allah drums before you. Her parades became a central part of Mesopotamian and Middle Eastern popular culture, and at the same time were an intrinsic part of her cult and worship. Therefore, we might expect that the spirit of Ishtar, upon its return, would seek to commemorate the Stonewall riots with processions and parades, and that's exactly what happened. The goddess would create a new ritual, a parade, and celebration that would eventually become a central component of American and Western culture. At the same time, it would increasingly take on the aura of a religious festival. The Stonewall Parade. 5 months after Stonewall, gay activists met in Philadelphia and planned a march to commemorate the Stonewall Uprising to take place the following summer in New York City. It was to be repeated every year on the last Sunday of June. 3 other marches were planned for that same weekend, one in San Francisco, one in Chicago, one in Los Angeles on Hollywood Boulevard. They were to be protest marches and parades at the same time. On June 28, 1970, the one-year anniversary of the Stonewall riots, the participants gathered in Greenwich Village near Stonewall to begin the Christopher Street Liberation Day March. The name was taken from the street on which riots erupted. Beginning with a few hundred participants, the march proceeded up 6th Avenue, where it swelled to a few thousand before reaching its destination at Central Park. As planned, the parade would be repeated every summer as an annual observance. With each passing year, more marches would be held in more cities across America and then around the world. They would be called Gay Liberation Marches, the Gay Pride Parades, and then simply Pride Parades. They all took place at the same time of the year to commemorate the uprising that brought them into existence. The first march in Los Angeles down Hollywood Boulevard was called the Christopher Street West Association Parade, to identify it as Stonewall's westward extension. And many of the Pride parades and festivities in Europe were part of what was called the Christopher Street Day celebration. All the Pride parades, marches, processions, and festivities had their birthplace in Stonewall. Could even this go back to an ancient mystery? The Gate of Ishtar. The most famous entranceway leading into ancient Babylon was the Gate of Ishtar. It was the starting point of the city's processional way. The great Babylonian parades would begin at the gate, then proceed down a half-mile road of ornate walls adorned with painted images. The goddess presided as queen of the great Babylonian processions and parades, and thus was the one who inaugurated them at her entranceway. So, too, it was the goddess who inaugurated the procession and parades that would cover the modern world. They began at Stonewall, the ground of her manifesting. Stonewall was her modern-day entranceway, the gate against which she pounded until it opened. Stonewall was the modern world's gate of Ishtar. So it was no accident that it would become the inauguration point and launching ground from which the parades of millions would begin. And so, as in ancient times, the most ubiquitous of the modern world's parades was set in motion at the gate of the goddess. Processional way. The ancient parades, begun at Ishtar's gate, made their way through the processional way to the Temple of Marduk, the city's central thoroughfare. So the parades inaugurated by the goddess in the late 20th century began in New York City, a Babylon of modern times, and proceeded along the city's central thoroughfare. And as the procession of Ishtar began at the gate, so the Pride parades began in New York City, the gate of America. They would then make their way through the central thoroughfares of the great cities of the modern world and then trickle down to the smaller ones. Gate of the Two Arches. As the ancient parades of the goddess began at the city wall, so her modern parades began at that which was named after a wall, Stonewall. The ancient parades began at the gate bearing the goddess's name, an entranceway covered with bricks. The modern parades of Ishtar were inaugurated at Stonewall, the wall of which was, like the gate of Ishtar, covered with bricks. The gate of the goddess was made up of 2 brick-covered archways, a smaller and a greater. The Stonewall Inn, likewise, possessed 2 brick-covered archway entrances, a smaller and a greater. In fact, it was these arch entrances that the mob of the Stonewall riots sought to break open and go through. As in ancient times, the massive processions and parades of the goddess began at the wall and the brick-covered arches of her gate. The lion, the bull, and the dragon. The gate of Ishtar was famous for its depictions of the lion, a symbol of the goddess. Thus the ancient processions began under the sign of the lion. The processions birthed at Stonewall also began under the sign of the lion, in that the lion's head marked the site of the uprising that birthed the parades. It was through the Ishtar gate that the gods entered the city in the form of idols and images. The gates and walls of the processional way were adorned with symbols of the gods, lions, dragons, and bulls. The lion, as we have seen, represented Ishtar. The dragon represented the god Marduk, who in Babylonian mythology was a lover of Ishtar. In the Bible, the dragon, of course, is also a symbol of Satan, and the bull was a symbol of the god Adad. In the land of the Canaanites, Adad was Hadad, and Hadad was Baal. Funny how they have so many different names for the same thing. Gateway of the gods. So the gate of Ishtar was the entranceway, the portal through which the gods entered. Thus the question, could the entrance of Ishtar at Stonewall, from which the modern processions were born, likewise serve as a portal, the gateway of the gods? In ancient times, Ishtar's parades would draw the people into her worship, so they would again. The celebrations were, in essence, spiritual and even religious in nature. In a panoply of music and color, American and Western cultures were being entranced into the worship of the goddess. If behind the parades of Pride Month were the processions of the goddess, could the descriptions of the ancient pageants give us revelation into the spectacles of our day? Chapter 43, Spectacles of the Enchanted. If we were back in ancient times and witnessed the parades of the goddess, what would we have seen? Do we have any idea? We do. Parade of the goddess. The ancient writings of Mesopotamia describe them. The people of Sumer parade before you. I say, Hail to Inanna, Ishtar, great lady of heaven. They beat the holy drum and timpani before you. They play the holy harp and timpani before you. The people of Sumer parade before you. Ishtar's parades involved harps and drums, music and rhythm. They could be somber or even anguish-filled processions, or loud, festive, and celebratory pageants. The parades were known for something else, the bending of gender. The people of Sumer parade before you. The women adorn their right side with men's clothing. The people of Sumer parade before you. The men adorn their left side with women's clothing. The parade of the goddess featured men dressed as women, women dressed as men, each dressed as both, male priests parading as women, and cultic women acting as men. They were public pageants and spectacles of the transgendered, the cross-dressed, the homosexual, the intersexual, and the cross-gendered. The return of the Mesopotamian parade. If the goddess was to return to the modern world and to Western civilization, what would happen? Could the procession of the goddess return as well? Could her parades of the cross-gendered, of the androgynous, the homosexual, the transsexual, of men dressing as women and women dressing as men, could they manifest again in the modern world? The mystery would ordain that they would, and that is exactly what would happen. The return of the goddess to Stonewall inaugurated the return of her ancient parades. After nearly 2,000 years, the goddess inhabited processions of the cross-gendered began reappearing on the urban streets of the modern world. Once they were seen in the streets of Uruk, Akkad, and Babylon. Now they would manifest in the streets of New York, London, and Paris. The pride parades were resurrections of the goddess's ancient cultic parades. Pageants of the cross-gendered. Even a modern transgendered commentator writing of the goddess's ancient festival could not fail to see the connection. The description of the festival appears to show the people of the city cross-dressing, specifically for the purpose of the celebration. Indeed, the whole thing sounds very like a gay pride parade. One paper on ancient views of sexuality, citing the processions of the goddess, notes that her cross-gendered participants took part in public processions, singing, dancing, wearing costumes, sometimes wearing women's clothes, and carrying female symbols. So the pride parade would involve the same elements: singing, dancing, costumes, men wearing women's clothing, and carrying female symbols. Men of colored fabrics. An ancient Sumerian inscription says this of the participants in the goddess's procession: "The male prostitutes comb their hair before you. They decorate the napes of their necks with colored scarves." A modern commentary on the inscription says this: "In order to look more like women, some of these homosexual priests let their hair grow long, and then, after tightening their hair grips for her, male prostitutes would parade before her, holy Inanna, Ishtar. Their locks of hair at the back are adorned for her with colored rags." The mention of both cross-gendered men and colored cloths is also striking, as both elements describe the modern pride parades. The prominent use of colored fabrics can be found in the clothing, signs, and flags displayed in the processions. Carnivals of Pride. The goddess's ancient parade is described by one Mesopotamian scholar as a carnival-like procession. So the pride parades of modern times, though born of protest, had likewise evolved into carnival-like processions. The writer goes on to describe other aspects of the ancient processions. Not only do the people parade playing musical instruments, but also costumed asexual or hermaphrodite personnel, transvestites wearing male attire on their right side, and female attired on their left. One can see each of these elements present in some way in the modern pride parades. The label pride itself is unwittingly connected to the goddess. Pride was central to her nature. One of her hymns addresses her as the impetuous lady, proud among the Anuna gods, full of pride. Muddy paints, artful eyes, and purple stripes. In his novel Metamorphoses, the 2nd century Roman writer, oh my goodness, they're killing me with these names, Apuleius, gives a glimpse into the spectacle that would attend the goddess's parades, as he described the trappings of the related ancient male priesthood of the Galli. The following day they went out, wearing various colored undergarments, with turbans and saffron robes and linen garments thrown over them, and everyone hideously made up, their faces crazy with muddy paints, and their eyes artfully lined. Some wore tunics fastened with belts, with purple stripes flowing in every direction like spears, and yellow shoes on their feet. Again we see the spectacle of men publicly displaying themselves as women, and adorning themselves with colored fabrics. Apuleius's description also includes the mention of eyeliner and heavily exaggerated makeup. These too have become defining elements of the modern pride parade, in its prominent displaying of transvestites, female impersonators, and drag queens. The footsteps of her priests. The goddess's parades were known for flouting societal norms and the distinctions of gender. Her modern parades would be known for doing the same. Descriptions of the ancient processions include such adjectives as licentious, bawdy, unbridled, and lewd. The same words would be used to describe their modern incarnations. Through the pride parades, the goddess would bring her flouting of convention into the modern world. She would use them to pound open the last closed doors of Western civilization. Millions of people around the world were now partaking in the goddess's revived processions, just as her priests and cultic personnel had done in ancient times. Millions were now walking in the footsteps of her ancient priests and becoming her servants. It was not only men who took part in the goddess's processions, but women. Their presence is another component of the mystery and the return that is now affecting our world. Its opening will take us from the islands of Greece to the streets of ancient Sumer, and from one of the goddess's most famous incarnations to a dance of swords. Chapter 44: Purple Garland and the Double-Edged Axe. Could the role that women played in the procession of the goddess reveal another side of the mystery? The women of the goddess. Women not only took part in the goddess's parades, but also displayed her power to blur, break, and switch the lines of gender, but from the other side. As the parading men assumed traditionally female roles, the parading women assumed traditionally male roles. It's never explicitly spoken, but the idea of lesbianism was always implicit. If under Ishtar's power women could take on the roles and functions of men, then taken to its ultimate conclusion, that would include the role and function of husband or lover. It was implicit in Ishtar's androgyny. In nature, temperament, and role, she was as masculine as she was feminine. She transformed herself from female to male and back again. This again would imply the altering of her desire, so though it was never overt, lesbianism was always implicit in the goddess's crossing of gender and sexuality. It was there as well among Stonewall's patrons, though making up a small component, women were among them. It was there the night it all began when a lesbian in handcuffs incited the uprising against the police, and it was there afterward in the gay pride parades, where lesbians made up a large part of the participants. Sign of the two Ishtars. But could there be more that joins the modern revival of lesbianism to the ancient goddess? Among the most basic modern representations of lesbianism is that of two crosses topped with two large circles intertwined with each other. Sorry, I got a dog barking. Sorry, I lost my place. Give me a second here. But could there be more that joins the modern revival of lesbianism to the ancient goddess? Among the most basic modern representation of lesbianism is that of two crosses topped with two large circles intertwined with each other, two symbols of the female joined to each other. How did the female symbol originate? Its first known appearance in that context is found in the works of the Swedish botanist Carl Linnaeus in the 18th century. He used it to represent female flowers. Linnaeus took the symbol from the Greeks, who used it to represent the metal copper, which was associated with the planet Venus. The planet was associated with the goddess Venus. Venus was the Roman incarnation of the Greek Aphrodite, and Aphrodite the Greek incarnation of Ishtar. Thus the sign that to this day represents the female, known as the Venus symbol, ultimately goes back to Ishtar, and thus the symbol for lesbianism, based on the symbol of Venus, likewise goes back to the goddess. The sign is in fact that of two Venuses, two goddesses, two Ishtars intertwined with each other. Sappho and the Terrible Enchantress. The modern revival of lesbianism takes inspiration from the Greek poet Sappho. Sappho led a theosos, a community of young women for which she served as a teacher. Her sexuality is to this day a matter of debate, but her writings appear to indicate a romantic or erotic attraction to women. The patron deity protecting Sappho's community was the goddess Aphrodite, the Greek incarnation of Ishtar. Sappho worshipped the goddess and wrote of being intimately acquainted with her. Her poetry is filled with elements from the goddess's cult, rites, and worship. Only one of the Sappho's poems still exists in its entirety. It is a prayer to Aphrodite, whom she addresses as the terrible enchantress. Prominent in Ishtar's cult were prayers to the goddess entreating her to use her magic to alter the affections of others. That, in fact, was Sappho's prayer. But the object of her affection is a woman. In the poem, the goddess appears to Sappho and assures her that she will cause the woman to love her. Sappho was born on the Greek island of Lesbos. From the name of that island comes the word lesbian. Thus, behind the word lesbian is the island of Lesbos. Behind Lesbos is Sappho. Behind Sappho is Aphrodite, and behind Aphrodite is Ishtar. It all goes back to Ishtar. The violent crowned goddess. It is from the Sappho and the island of Lesbos as well that the colors purple and violet, and from this lavender, have become associated with lesbianism. Her poetry is adorned with mentions of purple or violet. It is from Sappho as well that the violet became the symbolic flower of lesbianism. She writes more than once of a woman crowned with a garland of violets. Even in this is the goddess. Aphrodite was the violet-crowned goddess. Thus, even the colors and flowers of lesbianism went back to the ancient goddess, the incarnation of Ishtar. Good morning. I have a couple, or Aberdangela. Angela Aberd, I'm guessing. Good morning. The double-edged axe. In the 1970s, a symbol was adopted by the emerging lesbian movement. It was the most prominent of the movement's first symbols. In 1999, the symbol was incorporated into a flag of purple that was to be used as a banner to represent the movement and lesbianism itself. The symbol was an axe with two blades, the double-edged axe, also known as the labrys. Why was it chosen to be the sign of lesbianism? It goes back to ancient times. On the island of Crete, the double-edged axe was a sacred symbol of the ancient Minoan religion. The symbol was associated with women. In the days of the Roman Empire, the double-edged axe was associated with the mythological warrior women known as the Amazons. The double-edged axe, as a symbol of women independent of men and taking on the nature and place of women, or of men, was thus chosen as a modern symbol of lesbianism. The ancient axe became part of gay pride parades, displayed on banners carried by those who saw themselves as heirs to the ancient Amazons. Weapon of the priestess. But the double-edged axe and its connection to the altering of gender goes back beyond the people of Greece and Crete. It is found in the writings of ancient Mesopotamia, in the city of Sumer. It appears in hymn to the goddess. It is from an inscription we have already seen, the describing of the goddess's parades, the male prostitutes, the men parading as women, the male and female transvestites, the cross-gendered, the sound of drums, and the colored fabrics. It says this: the people of Sumer parade before you. The young men who carry hoops sing to you. The carrying of hoops was associated with women. The young men are feminized, but it goes on. The maidens and coffered priestesses walk before you. They carry the sword. The young women and priestesses, on the other hand, are carrying objects associated with men. They are the goddess's women who, following in her footsteps, take on the roles of men. As the goddess brandishes a sword in battle, so does the woman of her parade, or so do the women of her parade. But according to the account, the women brandish another object as well. They carry the double-edged axe. Hymns, banners, and spirits. So it is in an ancient hymn to the goddess that the double-edged axe makes its appearance, and the context of its appearance is that of women taking on the functions of men, and beyond that they take up the axe in the gender-crossing parade of the goddess. And now, in the modern world, the same object from Ishtar's processions was revived to serve as the symbol of lesbianism, women taking on the roles and functions of men. So the same weapon wielded by women in the ancient world to bend the lines of gender and sexuality now became the symbol of women in the modern world, bending the lines of gender and sexuality. And as gender crossing women lifted up the double edged axe as they marched in the goddess's ancient gender bending parades, now they would lift up banners emblazoned with the image of the very same axe as they marched in the modern gender crossing parades of their revival. The women had no idea they were replaying an ancient mystery, but the spirits have their own way. We saw in Stonewall how the mythic functions of the Babylonian calendar converged to determine the exact timing of the uprising. But the mystery of timing would not end on Christopher Street. It would spread into the mainstream culture until the world's yearly cycle was imprinted by it. Yet few in the modern world could have imagined that the calendar in which they lived their lives had been changed by a mystery that went back to ancient Mesopotamia and that was connected to mythology and the workings of the gods. To uncover the mystery, we must go back to the pagan celebrations of the ancient Phoenicia and the Latin writings of the early church father known as Saint Jerome. Chapter 45. Fix my screen here. Oh, another name. Junium, I think. There was one time of the year especially indwelled by the goddess, the month of her possession. Ishtar played a part in other holy days and festivals, but it was this one time of the year that her mythology, her passions, her frustrations and anguish, her desires and longings, her rituals, and her possessions of multitudes saturated Mesopotamian culture for an entire month. It was during those days that her spirit seemed everywhere. It was then that the people of Mesopotamia not only worshipped her, but in their passions became as her. They cried out for her lover Tammuz as if it were her crying out through them. They yearned as if it were her yearning in them. They moved in procession as if it were her moving in procession. So the prophet Ezekiel was given a vision in which he saw the women of Israel weeping, as if it were Ishtar weeping for Tammuz. The people became her channels. The goddess of possession possessed them. It was at that time of year that her mythology exerted an amplified power to infiltrate daily life. They were the days when, according to her mythology, she and Tammuz were separated. He was in the underworld, the land of the dead, and she was in the land of the living, seeking to be reunited. Rituals, observances, festivals, and processions dedicated to the goddess and the object of her desire took place throughout the Middle East. One could hardly escape it. During those days, the air was especially filled with her presence. The 29 days. What would happen if the goddess returned to the modern world? Would she again mark out and lay claim to a similar time of year? Would she again create rituals to be performed during that time, observances to be kept, festivals to be celebrated, and processions to be followed? And would her spirit again especially indwell those days? The answer is yes. That is exactly what she would do. Upon her return to Western civilization, the goddess set out to mark and lay claim to a space of time every year as her own, a time that her spirit could especially inhabit. As she was the goddess of pride, the time would be crowned with the name Pride. The time of the goddess and the object of her passions lasted approximately 29 days. So 1 month of the ancient Middle Eastern calendar was especially given for the possession of the goddess, her lover, and her mythology. Rites, festivals, and processions took place from the month's opening to its last day. So the mystery would ordain that the spirit of the goddess would again seek to lay claim to a similar space of time in modern times, 1 month of each year on the calendar of the civilization she was now seeking to possess. And so it happened in exact accordance with the ancient mystery. the sacred month. In the wake of Stonewall, gay activists established marches and parades to celebrate homosexuality, and then an entire week, Gay Pride Week. But in ancient times, the goddess laid claim to an entire month of observance and parades, and so Gay Pride Week was then transformed into Gay Pride Month. To increase its acceptability and further popularize it, its name would later be shortened to Pride Month. So, as in ancient times, the spirit of the goddess was given an entire month to indwell and possess. And as in ancient times, that month would be known for its processions and parades, observances, rituals, and the increase of her power. It was a strange phenomenon. The celebrating of that which once occupied the forbidden corners of society had come to permeate and dominate American and Western culture. America and other nations of the West were now devoting an entire month to honor, praise, and celebrate a form of sexuality that a little while earlier had been nearly universally viewed as a form of immorality. Now it was being treated as sacred. A strange veneration. Equally strange, nations were placing the celebration of this mode of sexuality above their own holidays. Nations would typically devote a day to the celebration of their birth or independence, but they were now devoting almost 30 times that amount of time in order to celebrate a particular form of sexuality. And it was happening all over the world. Nations with little in common were now celebrating the same holiday, giving homage, veneration, and praise, all to the same thing and to that which they had only a little while earlier deemed to be sin. What could account for such a strange and dramatic transformation? It was more than natural. It was the work of the gods. In all of history, there had never been a phenomenon quite like it, and yet Pride Month was the resurrection of the ancient month of the goddess's possession. So now again, as in ancient times, an entire month was given to the indwelling of a spirit that blurred and broke the lines of gender, that feminized men and masculinized women, that turned the one into the other and caused them to be paraded in the city streets. Finding Tammuz. When in the ancient year did the days of the goddess and her lover fall? They fell in the summer. It was the ancient month of Tammuz. Since it was based on the lunar cycle, its timing, with regard to the Western Gregorian calendar, would of course oscillate. Tammuz can begin in June or July, but 70% of the time it begins in June. Jamieson, Fawcett, and Brown's commentary on the whole Bible, published in 1871, says that this is the month, and of its ancient celebration says, an annual feast was celebrated to him in June, hence called Tammuz in the Jewish calendar. The Bible commentator Joseph Benson, who lived in the 18th and early 19th century, wrote this of the month and its worship. Tammuz, which also is used for the 10th month, reckoning from the autumnal equinox, that is, the month of June, and Tammuz as the object of worship expresses the solar light in its perfection, as in the summer solstice. Benson brings out the link between the month of Tammuz and the summer solstice. There is only one month in which the summer solstice takes place each year, and that month is June. Junium. Saint Jerome, who lived in the Roman Empire at the time of its conversion from paganism to Christianity, was most famous for producing the Vulgate, the Latin translation of the Bible. But he was also known for writing biblical commentaries. One of these was on the book of Ezekiel. It was that book that contained the description of the Hebrew women in the spirit of Ishtar weeping for Tammuz. In commenting on the passage, Jerome drew from his knowledge of the observances, rituals, and practices that were still being performed at the time of his writing. His original words in Latin read, I'm not going to read that because it is actually in Latin. Adonis is called Tammuz, both in Hebrew and Syria. Then he writes of the god's death and the time of its occurrence. In the month of June is killed. So Jerome identifies the time of Tammuz's death as the mense junio, the month of June. He continues, They call this month of June by the same name and keep an annual festival in his honor. Thus, according to Jerome and other observers of his day, the month of Tammuz was equivalent, or most equivalent, to Junium Mensum, this month of June. Tammuz corresponds with Junium and Junium with Tammuz. June is also identified as the month in which the annual festival takes place, thus the identification of Tammuz with June, and thus June as the month of the annual celebration linked to the goddess and her mythology, our ancient ones going back to the Romans, those who gave the month of June its name. The repossession of June. So if the goddess returned, what would happen to the month of her possession? The calendar of the modern world was based not on that of ancient Mesopotamia or the Middle East, but on that of Rome. We might then expect that, of all the months she would consider, the month of the summer solstice, she would choose the month of the summer solstice. We might expect that she would choose the month that, more than any other, inaugurated the days of Tammuz, her lover, Junium Mensum, the month of June. So she would take special possession of it. She would turn June into the time of her channeling. And since June had long been known at the time of weddings, as the time of weddings, the joining of man and woman, its modern transformation would be all the more dramatic. And thus June became Pride Month, and Pride Month became June. As America and the West turned away from God and Christianity, the ancient month returned to the goddess. And as in ancient times, the summer solstice and the days it inaugurated marked the time of the goddess's processions and parades. The summer liturgies. The festival of the summer month, of which Jerome and others wrote, involved rituals of lamentation and mourning over Tammuz's descent. We know that women were involved in those rituals, but it was not women alone. The Asinu, the Kalu, and the Gala, the Ishtar's cross-gendered priesthood, the men who dressed as women, were given a central part in the rituals. They would lead the lamentations by chanting and wailing in the female dialect. So now, in the revived procession of June, men would again take on the attributes of women. After nearly 2,000 years, the month that Jerome called Junium had revived its pagan function as the vessel for the annual festival. June would again serve the instrument of the goddess's power, the time when her spirit would especially possess the culture in which she dwelled. Festival of Inversion. The month of Tammuz, or Junium, centered on the mythology of Ishtar and her lover, but it was not about their union. It was about their separation. It was about the obstruction of passion and desire. So the modern observances of June as the commemoration of the Stonewall riots were born of the same thing: frustration and anger over the obstruction of desire. The parades themselves were aimed at tearing down all walls of resistance and to remove the hindrances separating the desire from its fulfillment. Beyond this was a strange coming together of the goddess's observances. The timing of Pride Month harkened back to the days when Tammuz and Ishtar were separated, and thus to the theme of separation, the separation of man from woman and woman from man. It was thus the perfect time for a celebration of homosexuality, lesbianism, and alternate sexualities. But the revelry of Pride Month harkened back to the goddess's celebratory festivals. In Pride Month, the two came together. The modern observance was not the lamentation over the separation of male and female, but a celebration. It was now a festival that celebrated the separation, a month-long holiday that rejoiced in men separated from women and women separated from men. In this, the rites of the goddess converged into a festival of inversion. The licentious rites of midsummer. And yet the ancient rites and festivals observed in the month of Tammuz's separation were also noted for their sexual licentiousness. One commentator writes this of the festival, as practiced in ancient Phoenicia or Lebanon. The women of Gebal used to repair to this temple of Ishtar in midsummer to celebrate the death of Adonis or Tammuz, and there arose in connection with this celebration those licentious rites. The writer places the licentious rites at midsummer, the summer solstice in June. The 2nd century Syrian writer Lucian gives his own account of the rites and observances of June. I saw too at Byblos a large temple sacred to the Bybloean Aphrodite, Ishtar. This is the scene of the secret rites of Adonis, Tammuz. He goes on to describe how the women would shave their heads in homage to the slain god Tammuz, and that those who refused to do so had to offer their bodies to strangers as prostitutes and give the proceeds to the goddess as a sacrifice. The early church historian Eusebius writes of the same temple of Venus, Aphrodite, Ishtar, in Phoenicia, on which the rites and processions of June were centered. The votaries of impurity destroyed their bodies with effeminacy. Here men undeserved of the name forgot the dignity of their sex. Here too unlawful commerce of women and adulterous intercourse with other horrible and infamous practices. The Temple of Venus. The ending of the midsummer festival and the procession of the goddess is implicit in the writings of the early church historians Eusebius and Socrates Scholasticus. Both record the clearing away of the shrine of Venus, Aphrodite, Ishtar, in Lebanon by the Emperor Constantine. He likewise demolished the temple of Venus at Aphasia on Mount Libanus, good night with these names, and abolished the infamous deeds which were then celebrated. The temple or shrine of Venus at Aphaca on Mount Libanus served as the source of the festivals of which St. Jerome wrote and identified with June. So the festivals of June or Tammuz came to an end. Thus, one of the most overlooked signs of the conversion of Western civilization to Christianity was the ending of month-long celebrations of midsummer with its June parades and gender-crossing spectacles, and thus the return of the month-long celebration of midsummer, the revival of the June parades, and reappearance of the gender-crossing spectacles was not an accident. It was a sign of the de-Christianization of Western civilization and its subsequent repaganization. The Temple of Venus was ultimately the Temple of Ishtar. The ending of the June processions was linked to its destruction, and its destruction was linked to the exile of the goddess and the gods. So if the hallowing of June, the annual festival, the parades, and the processions of the cross-gendered should return, it would be a sure sign not only of de-Christianization and repaganization, but of that which accompanies both, the return of the goddess and the return of the gods. The return of Junium. For Christians of the first centuries, such as Eusebius, the rites of June and their associated practices could only be seen as celebrations of immorality. For Christians of the 20th and 21st century, the revived rites of June and their related practices would be seen in the same way. They were not alone. Many others in ancient and modern times would view it similarly. For those not swept up in its fervor, June's transformation was a mystery. The month-long celebration seemed almost religious in nature, and it was. It was the return of an ancient religious observance. The sacred procession of June was not a strange phenomenon to pagan culture. The sight of parades in which men dressed as women and women as men, and the distinctions of gender were blurred, was to paganize a familiar one. Their return was the natural outcome of the repaganization of Western civilization. What had begun with the turning away from God had now given birth to the rites and processions of the pagan summer festival. The parades had vanished with the gods. Their disappearance was a sign that the gods had departed. The return of the parades was thus the sign of the opposite: the gods had returned. And the rising magnitude of the summer celebration was a sign of the rising power of the gods and the intensifying hold they were exerting on America and the world. The departure from God had allowed the pagan mystery month to rise from the dead. June was reverting to its pre-Christian state. Junium was returning. Month of apostasy. In the Bible, the month of Tammuz is known for something else. It was in Tammuz that the nation of Israel first turned away from God and to the realm of gods and idols, to the golden calf. It was June that most often began that Hebrew month, and so now again June would mark the turning away of another nation and another civilization from God and to the gods. It was the month of apostasy, that of a nation and that of a civilization. What happened to June is another reminder that whenever a nation or civilization, or for that matter, a life, turns away from God, it will never remain neutral. It will never stay empty. It will become indwelled by something else, something other than God. It will become inhabited by the gods. Those who had taken part in the removal of prayer and the word from American public life could not have imagined what it would lead to. But the empty house could not stay empty. A civilization had turned away from its worship of God. Now the sacraments of a different worship had come in. The door was left open. The house was found empty. The spirits came in. The gods returned, and with them their holy days. Is it possible that behind a sign that now appears in everything from corporate logos, video games, and children's cartoons to t-shirts, coffee mugs, cereal boxes, and flagpoles of American embassies, a sign lifted up by the people of every background, by leaders and nations, lies an ancient deity? And is it possible that this sign that now covers the world actually serves as an instrument of that deity to the accomplishing of purposes unknown to those who bear it? Chapter 46, The Sign. One sign above all others has come to represent the movement that started at Stonewall, the sign of the rainbow. The rainbow flag was designed by Gilbert Baker, an openly gay man and drag queen, and was first flown on June 25, 1978. In 1994, the sign of the rainbow was adopted as the official symbol of gay pride. It soon became the ubiquitous symbol of the movement and all it represented, flown and recognized all over the world. But could even this be the manifestation of an ancient mystery? And could it go back to the gods? The original rainbow flag had 8 colors, each representing one of 8 elements of the movement. One would have expected the colors of the flag to represent such things as liberation, tolerance, respect, empowerment, or different people groups. But the flag and the colors of the rainbow it bore represented that which was altogether different. The flag was a representation of a strange assemblage of themes and elements that seemed to have little to do with one another. One would have been hard-pressed to find a common thread or unifying theme to bind them all together and make sense of it all. But there was a unifying theme and a common thread binding them all together: the goddess. Pink. It goes without saying that Ishtar was the goddess of sex. She was the embodiment of passion, love, lust, sexual desire, and sexual practices in every form. The first color of the original rainbow flag was pink, and it represented sex. Red. From Ishtar came life. She was the source of all fertility and procreation, the fruitfulness of the earth, of animals, and of humanity. She was the wellspring of all the generative powers of nature. When she was in the underworld, the generation of life came to a standstill. Ishtar was the goddess of life. The second color of the rainbow flag was red. It represented life. Orange. The preeminent Mesopotamian goddess of healing was named Gulya, but in time Ishtar appropriated from her the powers of healing, and Gulya fell into obscurity. Ancient inscriptions survive with prayers and prescriptions for healing addressed to or centered on Ishtar. She is the one of whom it is written, takes sickness away. It is written that her effigy was once carried as far away as Egypt to heal an ailing pharaoh. The third color of the rainbow flag was orange. It represented healing. Yellow. Ishtar was closely associated with the celestial lights. The morning and evening star would carry her name, Venus, and the moon was her father. But there was another celestial light that was intrinsically bound to her, the sun. The Assyrian sun god was named Shamash, the Akkadian word for sun. He was Ishtar's brother. Ishtar was, in fact, the sun's twin sister. So strong is her identification with the sun that we can find a sun disk at her side in many of her carved images. The fourth color of the rainbow flag was yellow. It represented the light of the sun. Green. Ishtar was, as were many of the pagan gods, an embodiment of nature. She represented the vital forces of nature, the fruitfulness of the earth, the rain, thunder, and storms of the heavens. She was among the prominent and central of all nature gods. The fifth color of the rainbow flag was green. It represented nature. Turquoise. As we have seen, Ishtar was deeply connected to the realm and practice of magic. Her name was especially invoked in the casting of spells and enchantments and what today would be known as the occult arts. She was the goddess of magic. The sixth color of the rainbow flag was turquoise. It represented magic. Indigo. Though Ishtar was the goddess of storms, on the other hand, because of it, it was to her altars that supplicants came, entreating her to grant them serenity. An old Babylonian hymn says this: "At her glance, serenity comes into being." The seventh color of the rainbow flag was indigo. It represented serenity. Violet. And of course, Ishtar was a spirit, just as the gods were typically viewed by their worshippers as spirits. Beyond that, we have seen the connection of the gods to the spirits, the Hebrew Shadim and the Greek Daimonia. Thus, the last color of the rainbow flag is of special note, violet. It represents spirit. What kind of spirit is represented? The color violet was especially connected to Aphrodite, the violet-crowned goddess. Aphrodite was, of course, an incarnation of Ishtar. So the first color set the stage as it represented sexuality, and the last color summed it up. It represented a spirit, the spirit of sexuality, the very goddess known from ancient times as Ishtar. Could there be more to the mystery? Rainbow Ishtar. Ishtar was goddess of the sky, queen of heaven, master of tempests, hurler of lightning bolts, giver of rain. The ancient hymn praises her for it. Loud thundering storm, you pour your rain over all the lands and all the people. She controlled the storm. She directed its every gust, every peal of thunder, and every drop of rain. And thus the rainbow was under her lordship and direction. There is an ancient Elamite inscription that reads, Manzat Ishtar. There is debate over whether the name Ishtar is to be taken just as it appears, or as a generic noun. Nevertheless, the inscription translates to the name Rainbow Ishtar. The Jewels of Heaven. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, in the wake of a colossal rain and deluge, Ishtar also came. She lifted her necklace with the jewels of heaven. The necklace with the jewels of heaven has long been understood as the rainbow. So in the aftermath of the storm, the goddess lifts the rainbow up into the sky. Thus, Ishtar has been credited as the creator of the rainbow. The goddess with rainbow eyes. Then there is the strange description of the goddess as contained in an ancient Babylonian hymn of her praise. Her eyes are multicolored and iridescent. The eyes of the goddess are of multiple colors, like the colors of the rainbow. The ancient word is translated as iridescent. Iridescent comes from the Latin root iris, which means rainbow. Iris is also the name of the Roman goddess of the rainbow. Thus, the eyes of Ishtar are like rainbows. As a rainbow. And then there is the myth of the goddess and the gardener. A gardener plants a tree under which the goddess lies down and falls asleep. While the goddess is asleep, the gardener rapes her. When she awakens and realizes what has been done to her, she flies into a rage and begins sending down plagues on the earth. She then goes to her father to seek his help, and he tells her where the gardener is hiding. She sets out to find him. How she sets out on her mission of vengeance is striking. She stretched herself like a rainbow across the sky and reached thereby as far as the earth. So, in order to accomplish her mission against the one who violated her, the goddess stretches herself like a rainbow across the sky. The goddess becomes as the rainbow. The rainbow becomes her mode of action and being. It became the means by which she executed her will. Ishtar is considered the first of the gods for whom we have written evidence. Her connection to the rainbow is most ancient, long preceding that of the Greek goddess Iris and others. She was joined to the rainbow from the very start, from the dawn of recorded history and mythology. The sign. So, what would happen if the goddess returned? Would the rainbow also return as a sign of her power? It would, and it has. It was no accident that the movement that had been birthed by the goddess should take as its symbol the sign of the goddess. Those who designed it, those who carried it, and those who adopted it to serve as the defining symbol of the movement had no idea of the connection. The movement that had crossed the boundaries of sexuality and altered the parameters of gender now adopted as its symbol the sign of the ancient goddess who had crossed the boundaries of sexuality and altered the parameters of gender. The movement that had made June its sacred month of observance and processions was now covered with the sign of the goddess, whose sacred month of observances and processions most often began in June. The goddess had marked her resurrected religion and worship with the sign of her ownership. Banner of war. The goddess had stretched herself across the sky in order to punish her offender. The rainbow was a mode of war by which she executed vengeance and judgment. So too, behind the rainbow that began manifesting in the wake of Stonewall, was an ancient goddess arming herself for battle. And it would be through that sign that her war would be waged. Those who paraded with it, those who wore it on their clothing, those who raised it outside their office buildings, those who disseminated it on the internet, and those who placed it on their products had no idea of the spirit that lay behind it or the end to which it led. Behind its flowing colors was a banner of war. As in her ancient mythology, the rainbow would be the means and mode by which the goddess would again seek to exact vengeance on those whom she believed had wronged her, especially on those who had cast her out. Could a mystery that goes back to the temple of ancient Babylon actually be determining the cases, the workings, and even the rulings of the U.S. Supreme Court? Chapter 47, Days of the Goddess. The rites of the goddess were meticulously timed. They could only take place on the days appointed according to the Mesopotamian calendar. So, as we have seen, the goddess's entrance and the inauguration of her resurrected movement at Stonewall took place at the exact time ordained by the Mesopotamian calendar and the ancient mystery. According to the mystery, it took place in the month of Tammuz and on the Western calendar in the month of June. It was set in motion within days of the summer solstice and centered on the full moon of Tammuz, all linked to the goddess. It was all sealed on June 26, 1969, the 10th of Tammuz, the day that in the Babylonian calendar was ordained for the casting of spells to cause a man to love a man. But could there be even more to the mystery? Could it be that behind some of the most pivotal events of American culture lies the calendar of the goddess? And could their timing reveal her fingerprints? The Tammuz marches. Before Stonewall, there was a series of protests or pickets on behalf of homosexual rights, known as the Annual Reminder or the Reminder March. The protests took place in Philadelphia by Independence Hall every year on Independence Day. They were small and for the most part ignored by the media, but after Stonewall, the Reminder March would be moved to New York City and would transform into the Pride Parade. The first Reminder March took place in 1965 in the summer. In the ancient month of Tammuz, it fell on Tammuz 4. The second took place in 1966, also in the month of Tammuz, on Tammuz 16. The third in 1967 took place within days of Tammuz. The fourth in 1968 took place on Tammuz 8, and the fifth and last in 1969 took place on Tammuz 18. Thus 80% of those early marches took place in the month of the goddess and her lover Tammuz. All of them took place in or by Tammuz, the same month in which the Stonewall riots broke out. But the reminder marches took place before Stonewall. The timing of the one had nothing to do with the other. The scheduling of the reminder march was based on American history. The timing of Stonewall was based on a deputy police inspector's planned raid and an explosion that was planned by no one. Yet they both fell in the ancient Mesopotamian month connected to the goddess. Beyond that, the first reminder march took place on an ancient Mesopotamian holy day connected to the ceremonial funeral of the goddess's lover. So did another. A third took place on another ancient Mesopotamian holy day, this one appointed for a ceremonial procession in honor of Ishtar's lover. Toward the end of June. Then came Stonewall, and from Stonewall, the days and weeks and then months of Pride. All these would take place, as we have noted, in June, the month that, more than any other, began the observance and celebrations of Tammuz. But the timing was more specific. In his seminal work, Tammuz and Ishtar, after comparing the Sumerian, Assyrian, and Babylonian calendars and Mesopotamian agricultural cycles, Stephen Langdon concludes, "This is conclusive evidence that the wailings for Tammuz were held toward the end of June, from remotest antiquity." Though the lunar-based calendars of Mesopotamia oscillate with regard to the modern solar-based Gregorian calendar, there are several factors that converge toward the end of June. Though the festival of Tammuz could begin in early June, the central or median time for its beginning is in the days toward the end of June. Further, the summer solstice, of critical importance on the pagan calendar and linked to the descent of Tammuz, always takes place toward the end of June. It was no accident that beyond the fact that Pride Month was June, its focus was likewise always the last days of the month, the days toward the end of June. The commemorations, observances, celebrations, and pride parades most often clustered around the days toward the end of June. They would typically be held within a week or just days from the summer solstice, the time of pagan celebration. The first door, legalization of homosexuality. At Stonewall, the goddess forced open an ancient door. It was the first of several such doors and openings. Among the most momentous of these took place in the United States Supreme Court, in 3 landmark cases. The first door and first case was the Lawrence v. Texas in 2003. It resulted in the Supreme Court decision that legalized homosexuality throughout the United States. It would be cited later that same year by the Massachusetts Supreme Court in the ruling that legalized same-sex marriage in that state, the first such legalization in America. Lawrence v. Texas represented the opening of the door that had closed on pagan sexuality in ancient times. It was thus covered in the goddess's fingerprints. When was the Supreme Court decision handed down? It happened in the summer, in the month of June. It came toward the end of June, the specific time that Langdon had cited for the ceremonies and worship of Tammuz and Ishtar. The timing of the Supreme Court decision had nothing to do with the timing of Stonewall, any more than the timing of Stonewall had anything to do with the timing of the reminder marches. The timing in this case was determined by the schedule and functioning of the Supreme Court, and yet every event would converge within days of the others, and all at the same time of year, ordained for such things in the ancient calendar. June 26, 2003. More specifically, the ruling that legalized homosexuality across America was handed down on June 26, 2003. June 26 was the same exact date that the Stonewall Uprising was sealed, when its warrant was issued, and the legal authorization was given to set everything else in motion. So the ruling that legalized homosexuality across the nation happened to fall on the anniversary of the day Stonewall was sealed. The mystery had ordained it. The second door, overturning the defense of marriage. The second door was forced open in the landmark Supreme Court case of the United States v. Windsor in 2013. It resulted in the ruling that would overturn the Defense of Marriage Act. It would lead to the federal government's recognition of same-sex marriages performed in states where it had at that point been legalized. It would also open the door for an even more momentous Supreme Court ruling that would come 2 years later. When was the ruling that overturned the Defense of Marriage Act handed down? It happened in the summer of 2013, in the month of June, within days of the summer solstice toward the end of June, the days especially identified with the festival of Tammuz. It was handed down in the days of the ancient month of Tammuz. June 26, 2013. On what exact date did the ruling come? The Defense of Marriage Act was overturned on June 26, 2013, 10 years to the exact same day the Supreme Court legalized homosexuality in 2003. Both of the rulings opening the door to the normalization and establishment of homosexuality fell on the same date, and both on the date that sealed Stonewall, the event that began the opening of that door. The third door, the overturning of marriage. The third door was forced open in the Supreme Court case of Obergefell versus Hodges. It resulted in a momentous ruling that would strike down the historic, biblical, and age-old definition of marriage as the union of a man and woman. It legalized same-sex marriage across America. As marriage was the core relationship of family, and family the core unit of civilization, the transforming of marriage would ultimately mean the transforming of civilization. The ruling would affect law, education, commerce, religious freedom, and virtually every other realm of American culture. It was monumental, and behind it was the hand of the goddess. When did it take place? The historic definition of marriage was struck down in the summer, in the month of June, within days of the summer solstice toward the end of June. Marriage, as it had always been known, was struck down in the ancient month of Tammuz, the month of the goddess's passion. June 26, 2015. When exactly? Marriage as the covenant of man and woman was struck down on June 26, 2015. I mean, these exact dates, you guys. The same exact date that the Defense of Marriage Act was overturned in 2013. The same exact date that homosexuality was legalized in 2003, and the same exact date that Stonewall was sealed in 1969. And the date that sealed Stonewall was itself the same date on the ancient calendar appointed for the casting of the spell to cause a man to love a man. And so all three landmark events that pushed open the ancient door took place on the exact same date. On top of that, each was the anniversary of the date Stonewall was sealed, which was the beginning of the opening of that door, and which was itself on the ancient calendar, the day appointed for a man to love a man. And thus all four events were joined together to the ancient day of the ancient spell. Fingerprints of the gods. All three Supreme Court rulings took place on one of the days of Tammuz, the ancient month in which the union of female and male was broken. The month of Tammuz was the day of the first torchlight procession commencement, or commemorating the separation of the male and female god. It was on that day that marriage, as the union of male and female, was struck down. It's hard for the modern mind to fathom the idea that the political, cultural, and judicial events of modern times could be determined by an ancient mystery from the Middle East. But the exact convergence of all these events and factors is stunning. No one single person was there, present in each of these events, to cause them all to converge. Each series of events was determined by different people, different circumstances, different decisions, different considerations, and different dynamics. One was based on the founding of America, another on a chaotic uprising that no one could have orchestrated, and another on the logistics and workings of the Supreme Court. And yet they all fell into place according to the ancient mystery. All three Supreme Court rulings on the exact same day, and the day Stonewall was sealed. They all converged at a time of special import and intensity on the ancient pagan calendar. They all took place at the time specifically connected to an ancient spirit, and the spirit especially connected to the bending of gender and the altering of sexuality. Night of the Rainbow. On the night that marriage was struck down, a sign appeared across America. It was the sign of the goddess, the rainbow. That night the sign marked the nation as it never had before. The sign of the goddess lit up the Empire State Building. It lit up waters of the Niagara Falls. It lit up the iconic castle at Disney World. And most dramatically, it lit up on the building which America was governed, the White House. Hello, Lisa Jax. Yes, I am mostly back on my feet, working on it. It's not been easy. Night of the Ancient Spell. In the ancient Babylonian and Hebrew calendars, each day begins at sundown. The ruling came down early in that day. On the ancient calendar was the 9th of Tammuz. But the night that crowned the Supreme Court's overturning of marriage, the night the colors of the rainbow lit up the White House, was a new day on the ancient calendar. It was the 10th of Tammuz. The 10th of Tammuz was the day appointed from ancient times for the spell to be cast to cause a man to love a man. So the Supreme Court's monumental ruling to overturn marriage, enabling a man to marry a man, was crowned at nightfall by the 10th of Tammuz, the ancient day of the enchantment to cause a man to love a man. The spell had been cast, and the sign of the goddess marked the land, even the house from which the nation was governed. It was a sign of ownership. The spirit of the goddess was moving to take possession of America. To Ishtar belonged the power of metamorphosis, by which she could transform a man into a woman and a woman into a man. But what if her powers of metamorphosis were applied to a culture, a nation, or a civilization? What if the transitioning of a man or a woman was a microcosm of the transitioning of an entire culture, nation, and civilization? Chapter 48, The Grand Metamorphosis. To change a man into a woman, or a woman into a man, is to change identity. Thus the goddess possessed the power to transform identity. So she would now set out to transform the identity of America. The American metamorphosis that spanned the mid-20th century to the early 21st century was so radical and profound that the latter America would be largely unrecognizable to the former. Hello, holding my groin. I'm doing okay. 2,000 followers on. Did I get 2,000? That's awesome. Yay! I didn't even see that. That's pretty cool. now I'm going to be grinning like an idiot. The altering of memory. One's identity is rooted in one's past. So to completely transform another's identity, one would have to alter their past, or their memory of it, or how they perceived it. So the spirit of the goddess would set out to alter America's memory. It would have to be rewritten. America would be given an altered memory, an altered history. Old landmarks and monuments would be reinterpreted or removed. New landmarks and new monuments would be established. The Stonewall Inn, the site of the uprising against the police, would now become a national landmark. A new history, a new national memory would be inculcated into the minds of American children in classrooms across the country. And as time went on and the metamorphosis progressed, the nation was less and less able to remember what it had once been, or that it had ever been anything other than what it is now. A transitioned past would produce a transitioned nation and a transitioned future. The transitioning of America. To transform a man into a woman or a woman into a man means the transforming of priorities, proclivities, values, and desires. The man who desired women and not men would now, as a woman, presumably desire men and not women. Each would now accept what they had once rejected and reject what they had once accepted. So it would be in the goddess's transitioning of America. She would change the nation's priorities, proclivities, values, and desires. What the culture once rejected, it would now accept, and what it once accepted, it would now reject. Once it saw what it once saw as wrong, immoral, or evil, it would now see as good, and what it once saw as good, it would now see as wrong, immoral, or evil. What it once found abhorrent or shocking, it now venerated as sacred, and what it once venerated as sacred, it now found abhorrent and shocking. As the spirit of the goddess transitioned male to female and female to male, it was now transitioning a Christian civilization. It was being altered step by step into a pagan one, and one nation under God into one nation under the gods, becoming the opposite. Hello to people just joining. For the goddess to change a man into a woman or a woman into a man, she had to nullify the original nature and biological state into which the individual was born. So to transition America, she would cause the nation to war against its own foundation, its original nature, and its historic identity. She would cause the nation to hate and condemn what it once was. She would do likewise to Western civilization. Both America and Western civilization would be transitioned into the opposite of what they had been. Accompanying the transformation was her sign, the rainbow. It became the ubiquitous sign of the transformation. She had used her ancient strategy and her mode of battle and retaliation. She stretched herself like a rainbow across the sky and reached thereby as far as the earth. So it was again through the sign of the rainbow that the goddess was able to stretch herself across the landscape of American culture and the modern world and enlarge herself and her movement. Every year it seemed as if the rainbow grew in presence and power. It was a sign that the goddess's power was likewise growing. The symbol from the fringe of American culture was now taking it over. The sign of the goddess began appearing everywhere, in stores, on mugs, on t-shirts, blankets, stationery, and on merchandise of every kind. Crosses into rainbows. In ancient times, the goddess was linked to the government and political power. So she would be again. The American government would come under her spell, while crosses and other symbols representing God, Scripture, and the Christian faith were being removed from public property and the public square. The sign of the goddess was brought in to be displayed in their place. The rainbow was enshrined in the public square. It began manifesting on public property, in municipal halls, and in government buildings. So too law enforcement would begin coming under her spell. Police officers would now march in her processions, and the rainbow now began appearing on police cars. The Stonewall Uprising had begun as a war against the police. Now the goddess was beginning to take them over. I am doing okay. I still am fighting one kidney stone. Hopefully this week. I'm so over it, you guys. 3 seems like a bit of harsh punishment. I don't know what I did. Emblems and logos. Hello, Star. We're getting a lot of people come in here late. That's cool. Just you can enjoy this book wherever we're at. It's a good read. Emblems and logos. The American flag represents the nation to the world. It was flown outside every American embassy in every nation where there was an American embassy. But a new banner was now being flown along with the American flag on American embassies, the rainbow flag. It was unprecedented. The sign of the goddess now became, in effect, a representation of America. It was a sign that America itself was now being transitioned. So too the corporate world would become subject to the goddess's spirit. Major corporations now began not only adopting her agenda, but sanctifying her sign. They created new versions of their own logos, rendered in the colors of the rainbow. During Pride Month, they would proudly display their rainbow logos to the world. Logos represent identity. The new altered rainbow logos were a sign. The goddess was altering their logos as she was altering their identities. She was transitioning them as well. Children of the rainbow. The goddess and her fellow gods were especially interested in children. If she could transition them, if she could change their nature, she could alter the future. She could possess the world. So the sign of the goddess began appearing on the flagpoles in front of their schools, high schools, middle schools, elementary schools. In classrooms across America, children were now being taught to revere the rainbow flag, to hallow the rainbow flag, and to follow the ways of the goddess. And when the children came home from school, they would see her sign appearing in their cartoons on television and in their games, videos, and postings on the internet, likewise inducting them to her service. Even the packaging on children's snacks, cookies, and candies would now bear the sign of the goddess. Even cereal boxes were now covered in rainbows and words that urged children to embrace sexual identities other than what they had been born into. The nation's children were being placed in the goddess's hands. Entutoi Nika. Why does he do this to me? The ascendancy of the rainbow and all that it stood for was not a natural phenomenon, it was supernatural. Its veneration was not based on logic, but on spirit, the spirit of a goddess. It was the sign of her presence, her power, and her dominion. Everywhere the image appeared, everywhere the rainbow flag was raised, her powers increased. She had begun with a handful of followers at Stonewall. Now she had placed her mark of ownership on countless millions and on America itself. The conversion of the Roman Emperor Constantine was one of the most important events in world history. It happened through a sign. Before his battle against the Emperor Maxentius of the Milvian Bridge, at the Milvian Bridge in AD 312, Constantine saw a vision. Above the sun was a cross of light and the Greek words "en tautoi Nika," in this conquer. The sign was thus crucial in the conversion of a pagan civilization into a Christian one. But now there was another sign, the rainbow, and by that sign the goddess would war against the cross. In that sign she would also set out to conquer. The rainbow was likewise a sign of conversion, but this time the conversion would be of a Christian civilization into a pagan one. So the appearance of the rainbow was, in and of itself, a sign that a once Christian nation and a once Christian civilization were in metamorphosis to paganism. The goddess's hands were at work, performing a surgery of spirit. They were all being transitioned. As we approach the last section, we will focus on the end of things, the end of the mystery, the end game of the gods, the last of all states, and the conclusion we must draw. And we will ask and answer the final question: why have the gods returned? What is their aim? What lies ahead? And what does it have to do with us now in the days to come and beyond? Okay, so that leaves us, it's like 12 pages, guys. I'm going to finish it. Chapter 49, Vengeance of the Gods. I think it's good that we finish it too now because we're in Pride Month, and I think this is good information to have, and gives us a perspective on all of this confusing stuff that's going on. So I think we finish. Chapter 49. If you get tired, you can always stop and come back later. Vengeance of the Gods. We must now ask the question: if the gods that were cast out with the coming of Christianity returned, would they not come back with a vengeance? And would not their vengeance be focused on those who cast them out? If the birth of the Christian faith meant the end of the gods, then upon their return, would they not seek its end? The 2,000-year-old vendetta. As the gods had thrived in a pre-Christian age, they would now seek to usher in a post-Christian age. And if the entrance of Christianity brought about the casting out of the gods from Western civilization, then upon their re-entering, they would seek to bring about the casting out of Christianity from Western civilization. Or in the context of the parable, as the spirits had been cast out of the house, they could only return by casting out that by which they had themselves been cast out, the Spirit of God. The spirits would wage war against that which had waged war against them, the Spirit of God, the Word of God, the ways of God, the house of God, and the people of God. Into the catacombs. As the gods had been driven out of the mainstream of culture of the ancient world, they would now seek to drive God and those who followed him out of the mainstream of modern culture. As the gods had once been driven to the margins and shadows of their culture, they would now seek to drive Christians to the margins, to the shadows, to the closets and catacombs of modern culture. Silencing of the word. The gods had once been silenced by the word of God, so now they would seek to silence the word of God and the Christians who upheld it. They would work to drive the word out of Western culture, just as the word had once driven them out. The gods had seen laws enacted against them, encroaching on their worship and temples, so now they would work to have laws enacted in Western nations that would encroach upon Christianity, its worship, churches, and ministries. Children of the gods. It was ultimately the young who undid the gods. The children of the late Roman Empire were no longer effectively indoctrinated into paganism. They were now taught of the new faith and against the rites and worships of the gods. So upon their return, the gods would seek to undo their undoing. The removal of prayer and scripture was only the beginning. They would seek to gain control of the young, and they would do so through the media, television, internet, and through the classroom. The children would increasingly be taught to reject Christianity and despise biblical values. With or without the mention of the gods, they would be indoctrinated into their ways, into pagan values, so that the ways of God would become alien to them. At the same time, the gods would attack the transmission of the Christian faith from parent to child and from teacher to student in Christian schools and universities. As they had once been cut off from influencing the young and cast out by a new generation, the gods would now seek to cut off the young from the Christian faith and to use the new generation to cast out the Christian faith and bring Judeo-Christian civilization to an end. The Dark Trinity's War. It was war, and the gods of the Dark Trinity were ready for battle. Baal was a warrior, Molech was a murderer, and as for Ishtar, she was both a warrior and the executor of vengeance, and it would be her sword that would serve as the most prominent weapon in the war to destroy the faith that had cast her out. As the goddess of sexuality, gender crossing, and battle, she would employ all three in a massive and multi-front campaign of annihilation against Christians and their faith. When the historic and biblical definition of marriage was struck down in June of 2015, many saw it as a watermark, not only in the history of America, but of Western civilization. Age-old biblical standards and values concerning sexuality, marriage, and gender were discarded and replaced overnight with pagan ones. Christians were now told that they would have to comply with the new morality, its tenets and acts, to endorse them and propagate them. By force of social or economic pressure or by force of law. If they refused or voiced disagreement, they would now be subject to serious consequences, the loss of their jobs, the boycotting of their businesses, deplatforming, defunding, prosecution, or other punishments. There was now a phenomenon that had no precedent in the West, the placing of Christians on trial in once Christian nations for the crime of quoting the Bible. Such trials almost always concern sexuality and gender, the issues and workings of the goddess. She cuts to pieces him. It was not new to the gods. Before they departed Western civilization, they had waged war against the new faith and the first Christians. They were able at first to depict them as different, alien, foreigners, and a danger to society. They incited the people to fear and hate them. They moved upon the ancient magistrates and mobs to war against them, silence them, imprison them, and brutally murder them for public sport. One of the gods that warred against the first believers was Venus. Venus was Ishtar. So it was written in one of her ancient Mesopotamian hymns, "She cuts to pieces him who shows no respect." In the war that was waged in ancient times against the gospel, the gods would cause Christians to be literally cut to pieces. But as more and more people embraced the new faith, the gods could no longer depict Christians as aliens. as different or as a danger to society. And when the gods were finally sent into exile, the persecution of Christians came to a decisive end. The Great Persecution, Part 2. For most of the following centuries, the gods and spirits were in no position to wage war or incite a persecution against those who upheld the scriptures or followed Jesus. They were hiding in the shadows, and in the early days of their return to the modern world, their position was too marginal and weak to launch any kind of persecution. But it was only a matter of time before that would change. As soon as they had become established, they would begin working toward the marginalization, encroachment, and persecution of believers. As the West began dechristianizing and repaganizing, the gods could again begin depicting Christians as different, alien, foreign, and a danger to society. Again, they could begin setting the culture to war against them. Again, they could incite a generation to fear and hate them, and now the gods had powers unavailable to them in ancient times: mass media, social media, the World Wide Web. And as in the days of Rome, they could portray Christian descent from sin. They could portray Christian descent from sin as intolerance and hate-mongering, and the speaking of God's word as a blasphemy, an act of criminality. In an earlier day, the values upheld by Christians would have been lauded as virtues, but now they would be despised. The Christians had not changed, but the culture around them had. It had been transformed so totally that it could not even remember ever being otherwise, that it had once been Christian. So for the first time in 2,000 years, believers found themselves in the midst of a pagan civilization. And just as it had 2,000 years earlier, it would mean persecution. Thank you, Lorraine. You guys are so sweet. Thank you for praying for me. You guys, that means a lot to me. It's no small thing to pray for somebody. You're very sweet. All right, let me get those off there. Okay. Against the throne of God. The gods had an ancient score to settle with their enemies. They would now make up for lost time. They were dangerous. The danger they posed could not be measured by anything seen thus far, for it was tied to how much power they possessed, and their power was continually increasing. So too the danger. In the myth of the gardener, the goddess stretched herself across the sky like a rainbow for the purpose of executing vengeance. The rainbow again would be linked to vengeance. But this time it would be directed against believers. Behind its colors were centuries of pent-up fury. It was as well a sign of war against God. It was always the goddess's nature to take what belonged to others and use them for herself. The rainbow belonged to God. It is described in Scripture as being part of the glory that surrounds his throne. It was also the sign of his mercy in the wake of judgment. But the goddess of transformation had transformed the sign of God into a sign of defiance against the ways of God. It was a banner of war. Wow, think about that. Those who joined in its display had no idea what they were doing, or that they were being drawn into an ancient war against the throne of God. I had just never thought of that. I never thought of that flag banner, being a banner of war. Which is kind of interesting that didn't occur to me, because, how often is that said, that they're at war against us, and, they're trying to, take us out, basically. Whether that be through marginalizing or deplatforming or other means. The gods had been expelled, and they had now returned. They would seek retribution against those who had cast them out and sent them into exile. In ancient times, their fury was so fierce that it caused the Christians to be led into the arenas to be devoured by wild animals, to the cheers of the Roman masses. To what would it lead now? Could the growing movement to curtain free speech in the West, whether in the form of political correctness, wokeism, cancel culture, or the growing danger of soft totalitarianism, be connected to the mystery of the gods? And could the day come, as it came in ancient times, when the refusal to bow one's knee before the gods would incur the most grave of consequences. Chapter 50. We're getting close, guys. Only a few pages left. Every knee shall bow. The gods had come back not only to exact vengeance, but for dominion. They had returned to reign. In ancient times, they had reigned over the culture in which they were enshrined, but when those cultures turned to God, they were forced to abdicate, to leave their thrones and go into exile. Having returned, they would again lift their scepters and aspire to mastery and dominion. Kingship of the gods. Baal, the first of the Dark Trinity, was known as King of the Gods and Lord of the earth. The name Baal, or Lord, owner, and master, was not only his title, but a description of his nature. He would seek to master, to own, and to lord. In his mythologies, he battled other Canaanite gods to gain or regain lordship and authority. The ancient Baal epic reveals his ambition. Mighty Baal desired the kingship of the gods, and he would have it. He would become the undisputed lord of the Canaanite deities. The same spirit would war against the God of Israel. The days of Baal. It was through a spirit of tolerance and openness that Baal gained entrance into the culture of ancient Israel. But once his worship and cult became widespread and established, once it touched the highest levels of authority, everything changed. The tolerance of earlier days came to an end. Okay, guys, listen closely to this part. We talked about it being all about tolerance and, loving everybody and accepting everybody the way they are. And I'm going to read that again. But once his worship and cult became widespread and established, once it touched the highest levels of authority, everything changed. The tolerance of earlier days came to an end. It had served its function as a doorway through which Baal could enter. Baal now reigned as the nation's god, and there would be no room for the nation's former god. He would seek to achieve total domination. Everyone would now be required to call him Baal or Lord. Anyone and anything that now stood in his way was to be eliminated. He would war against God and his people and anyone who still upheld the former ways. He would use all means at his disposal, the power of culture, the power of state, and the power of his cult. Those who held to and upheld the ways of God would now be branded as troublemakers, agitators, and enemies of the state. Think about what's going on with the FBI right now in the Catholic Church. Thus came the days when the righteous were persecuted and the prophets were hunted down, the days of Baal. The opening and the closing. It goes back to the ancient parable. The spirits seek to return to the house. When one is trying to get into a house, one seeks openness. One pushes to open its door. So when the gods were seeking to get into the American house and that of Western civilization, the focus was on openness and tolerance. It was never really about either. Openness and tolerance were only the means of opening the door and to gain entrance. They were the way to cause a nation and a civilization to abandon the values they had long cherished for what was new and foreign. It was for that reason that the entrance of the gods was most dramatically seen in the 1960s, when openness and tolerance were sacred mantras. But once one gets through the door and inside the house, one no longer seeks openness. If one's aim is to stay in the house, then one now seeks to close the door. So once the gods came into America and became established, once people started accepting their ways and authorities, the ideal of openness would now work against them. They had to consolidate their power. They had to close the door. So there was a change in the atmosphere. A chill came over free speech. The doors began to close. Any dissent from the new morality could now be met with punishment. One was free to endorse the new ways of the gods, but one was not free to challenge them. Most people had no idea why it was happening or how it could change so dramatically, but it was the logical conclusion to the entrance of the gods. Baals of the universe. So as it was in the days of Baal in ancient Israel, it was in America. The earlier tolerance would be replaced by a new, enlightened intolerance. It would manifest as political correctness, then wokeness, and cancel culture. Every word that could now be interpreted as expressing dissent from the newly sanctioned view was subject to judgment and censure. Anything that could be interpreted as challenging or differing from the new morality had to be canceled. In ancient Israel, Baal could use kings and queens, and Ahab and Jezebel as his vessels to stamp out dissent and cancel the opposition. But now, in addition to the powers of the state, Baal could employ technology, social media, the internet to stamp out dissent and cancel the opposition. And with more and more communication taking place online, Baal and his fellow gods could control human speech, behavior, and thought in a way that was never before possible. It was no accident that in the last days before the destruction of Jerusalem, the prophet Jeremiah was thrown into prison. The gods had taken over the culture, and through the nation's leaders had sought to silence the prophets and all opposition. The tolerance for new gods had now morphed into a culture of oppression, a cancel culture. In the modern case, the leaders of Silicon Valley were more than willing to comply with the new directives of Baal. That which challenged the authority of the new gods would at their hands be canceled. Baal had been heralded as the Lord of the earth. The leaders of big tech had been labeled the masters of the universe. In biblical Hebrew, the word master is Baal, so the title could be rendered Baals of the universe. Ishtar unleashed. But Baal was not the only god seeking dominion. As the name Baal means Lord, the name Molech means king. Molech would seek his own kingdom. He could use the abortion industry and the extreme and the radically woke as his instruments. Then there was Ishtar. She too sought dominion. She craved it, even if it meant taking over the dominions of other gods. She took the powers of civilization away from her father. She attempted to take control of the underworld from her sister, and she was believed to have taken over the Iana temple from the sky god An. Ishtar would accept nothing less than the total submission of her subjects. If they refused, she would respond with fury. In one of her myths, she rages against a mountain that failed to show her reverence. As I, the goddess, approached the mountain, it showed me no respect. Since they showed me no respect, since they did not put their noses to the ground for me, since they did not rub their lips in the dust for me, I shall personally fill the soaring mountain range with my terror. You know, it's just me. I'm really visual. So I don't know if you guys remember that scene in Congress where all of the congressmen were kneeling and they had the scarf around their neck. As I, the goddess, approached the mountain, it showed me no respect. Since they showed me no respect, since they did not put their noses to the ground for me, since they did not rub their lips in the dust for me, I shall personally fill the soaring mountain range with my terror. Does that sound familiar to those of us who were like, whoa, whoa, wait a minute. Why are we bowing to man? We bow to God and that's it. It's definitely chilling to me. Since Ishtar was the goddess of war, her response to any perceived lack of homage or submission could be especially calamitous and deadly. She would seek to destroy any who did not reverence her. I don't know why he didn't use revere there. Her return to the modern world came, as it did for the other gods, through the doorway of tolerance. And upon gaining power, her focus would turn to dominion. Anyone who refused to pay her homage, anyone refusing to go along with her altering of sexuality, marriage, and gender, would suffer the unleashing of her fury. She would vilify them, portray them as haters, incite the culture against them, and seek to deprive them of their livelihood, their speech, and their freedom. The totalitarian gods. It was a strange transformation. Cultures that had for so long espoused the virtues of freedom and tolerance would suddenly begin espousing the virtues of intolerance. Nations that had long venerated free speech as a sacred pillar of their democracy now venerated its suppression. But it was all part of the mystery ushered in by the returning gods. The open culture that welcomed them in began closing up. In place of tolerance and freedom of speech came ideological conformity and the crushing of speech and thought. They were signs. The gods were consolidating their hold on America and Western culture. One now had to watch every word that came out of one's mouth, every comment one posted online, even one's own thoughts. If one spoke or wrote in a way that violated the new dogmas of the gods, they were to be punished or were forced to publicly confess their sins. It was now a totalitarianism birthed of the gods' new dominion. The fury of the new order would fall on those who resisted it. It would fall, first of all, on those who upheld the ways of God, the Christians, those who followed God's word. Conservatives would also be targeted. The reason was simple. Conservatives sought to conserve. The gods sought to overturn. But even liberals who were not radical enough now found themselves under the siege by the more radical new guard. Liberal professors now found themselves attacked by their students for upholding free speech and in danger of losing their jobs. Old school feminists now came under fire for upholding the existence of women against the campaign to abolish them. But they had all been used by the gods. And now the agenda was moving to another stage and passing them by. They could be disposed of. The revolution the gods had inaugurated was devouring its own children. Chapter 51, Altars of the Gods. The prophet walked through the ruins of the holy city and wept. He had foretold its destruction. He had warned the people against the gods, but they rejected the warning. They continued in their course, turning all the more from God and all the more to their gods and idols. The gods had promised to give them prosperity, freedom, and fulfillment, but they had now given them their gift, destruction. Jerusalem now lay in ruins and burning ash, and the nation was no more. The altars. It was the inevitable conclusion. It was the nature of the gods to bring destruction. Their worship involved altars. Their altars involved blood, even the blood of children. That was the price of following them. That was the demand of the spirits. It's no accident that those most closely joined to the gods were those most likely to engage in acts of self-destruction. The priests of Baal slashed themselves. The priests of Ishtar spilled their own blood in the goddess's processions. And the worshippers of Molech offered up as blood sacrifices their own flesh and blood in the form of their children. The gods destroyed their own. The gods caused them to destroy themselves and to celebrate their own destruction. Wow. The keys of destruction. How did they do it? How did they cause their followers to destroy themselves? They removed from the lives of their subjects purpose and meaning. When life has no meaning, no purpose, no absolute value, it then proceeds toward death and destruction. The lives of children can then be disposed of and sacrificed. If the gods can remove purpose from sexuality, it can be repurposed in any direction, and it will stop producing life. Then it will give birth instead to death. If the gods can remove man from manhood and woman from womanhood, it will bring about destruction, the disintegration of family, society, and lives. If they can remove the purpose of marriage, then it too will disintegrate. When purpose is removed, destruction follows. So they did to ancient Israel. They drew the nation of God away from God and from the purpose for which it had been created. The gods removed the nation's reason for existing, and it ceased to exist. Filling the altar. So when the gods returned to the modern world, they set out to do the same. Sexuality was again removed from marriage, man from manhood, woman from womanhood, marriage from the state of marriage, humanity from humanity, and life from life. Behind it all was the removal of purpose. From that would come destruction, and in destruction their altars would be filled. The purpose of life can only be found in the one who created it, God. Therefore, to be separated from God is to be separated from one's purpose and reason for existing. And so the returning gods set their focus on separating all from God and each from its purpose. Judgment time. As the day of Israel's destruction neared, the shadow of the gods deepened. It was then that the prophet Jeremiah stood, overlooking the valley where the Israelites had built altars to Baal and Moloch and sacrificed their children. It was then that he prophesied the nation's destruction and smashed the potter's jar on the ground. It was then that the prophet Ezekiel was taken in a vision into the temple courts and saw the women of Israel in the spirit of Ishtar weeping for Tammuz. It was then that he saw the elders of Israel in the temple's inner courts worshiping the sun. And it was then that he heard the command given for the judgment to begin. I agree. It is right on with the description. So they did to ancient. Oh, I read that. As the days of Israel's destruction neared, the shadows of the gods, we read that. The nation's judgment was bound to the gods. The nation's destruction would come from Babylon and Mesopotamia, the land of the goddess and her fellow gods. Those who carried out the destruction were the worshippers and servants of the Babylonian and Mesopotamian gods. It would all begin in the month dedicated to the goddess and her lover, the month of Tammuz, the time of the summer festival, the June parades. It was the 9th day of Tammuz when the soldiers of Babylon broke through the defensive walls of Jerusalem. The city's hedge of protection was removed. Destruction would now be only a matter of time. The 9th of Tammuz would be commemorated as a national day of sorrow and mourning. Centuries later, the walls of Jerusalem would again be breached, this time by another pagan army, that of Rome. The judgment would begin in the same month, Tammuz. The Roman breaching of the city on the 17th day of that month would as well be commemorated as a national day of sorrow and mourning. In each case, the destruction began in the same month, the month of the god linked to Ishtar. That the nation's judgment began in Tammuz was significant as well, since Tammuz was the month of the nation's apostasy and judgment, starting with the golden calf. So the judgment came in the days of the gods. It was fitting, as it was the gods to which the nation had turned that would bring about its destruction. And that's so important, all of the false things to worship bring destruction. You submit yourself to them and you worship them, and then eventually they destroy you, because that is the goal of false gods, is to seek and destroy. Warning of judgment. What about America? The gods brought judgment and destruction to Israel. Could America likewise be in danger of judgment and destruction? Both nations had been dedicated to God at their inception. Both had turned away from God. Both had followed the gods Baal, Moloch, and the goddess. But America had gone further. It had become the world's primary vessel for the return of the gods. It had become the world's chief proponent of materialism, the worship of prosperity and money, sexual immorality, pornography, abortion, homosexuality, transsexuality, and the alteration of gender. America had single-handedly resurrected the goddesses' midsummer festivals and processions, which now covered the world. America had hallowed and championed the sign of the rainbow, not only within its borders, but around the world. To take the sign given of God's mercy in the wake of judgment and turn it against the ways of God is to call upon oneself a judgment with no mercy. So too America had chosen to strike down the ways of God in the month of the goddess and her lover, the month of gods and judgment, and it was no accident that it struck down the biblical hedge of marriage on the 9th of Tammuz, the very day that Israel's protective hedge was struck down, and that opened the way for the nation's judgment. The prophets warned Israel that to turn away from God, to follow after the gods, would lead to destruction. America has turned away from God and now follows after the gods. To what then will it lead? It must as well, in the end, lead to destruction. But judgment applies not only to nations, but to people. It applies to each of us to partake in a nation's war against God, to join in its defiance of God, to celebrate the destruction of his ways, to lead little children into confusion and alter their physical being, and thus to cause, in the words of Jesus, these little ones to stumble, to cause these still more little ones to be killed, or to passively condone such things by doing and saying nothing to stop them, is to partake in judgment and to invoke judgment upon one's own life. Then what are we to do? Is there an answer to the gods and judgment? Is there hope? For that we must go further. We must bring all things to their conclusion, and we must take one more step beyond the gods to another. This is the last chapter. Chapter 52, The Other God. So what does the return of the gods tell us? It tells us there is more to human events, to world history, and even to our own lives, more than we can imagine. Behind the natural realm lies a more than natural realm, and that which is more than natural can be good or evil. We are largely unaware of how the other realm is affecting our world and lives, but at times it manifests so strongly that it becomes hard to rationalize or ignore. Nazi Germany is one such case. It is so extreme that any attempt to explain it without accounting for that which is beyond the natural is destined to fail. It was not of the natural, but of a realm that is more than natural. And what is now happening to America and Western civilization is no less beyond the natural and of the other realm. A most dangerous thing. The mystery also tells us, as in the House of Spirits, that for a nation or civilization that has known God and turned away from him, and more specifically, that has known the gospel and turned away from it, is a most dangerous thing. And it is this that lies behind the strange and disturbing transformations overtaking American culture and Western civilization. The rise of irrational ideologies, the nullifying of biology, the denial of reality, the emergence of quasi-religious secular movements, the deterioration and transmutation of marriage, family, and gender, the alteration of children, the abolition of man and woman, the murder of the most innocent, the disintegration of society as we have known it, the rise of a new and subtle totalitarianism, and the silencing of all that question such things. Even many secular observers and those of no faith have noted that it seems as if something has come to possess America and Western culture. Something has taken it over. But we should not be surprised at what is happening. The mystery ordains it. A house that has emptied itself of God cannot remain empty. It will be seized and taken over by that which is not God. And when a civilization expels God from its midst, it never ends well. What we are now witnessing is as momentous as the Christianization of Western civilization at the very beginning of this age. Only it is its opposite. It is the casting out of the spirits in reverse. It is their invoking, their conjuring, and their reentrance. It is the repossession of the house. And according to the parable, when the spirits repossess the house, its last state will be worse than its first. The great apostasy. It is a basic tendency of human nature not to realize what one has until one no longer has it. Rarely do we discern the danger from which we are being protected until the protection is removed. When light is removed, its absence will always be occupied by darkness. And when God is removed, his absence will be occupied by evil. So the Bible foretells that in the last days there will be a great falling away from the faith, a great apostasy. It is now taking place. It also foretells that in the last days, evil and immorality will increase, and persecution will come for Christians, for all who hold true to the ways of God. The parable warns that the last state will be worse than the first, and the last state is not yet finished. We can therefore expect the dark to grow darker still. We have thus not yet seen the last or the worst of the gods. Against the gods, I hope that rain's not too loud. How then is one to live in the days when the civilization around us has become a house of spirits? How can one stand against the darkness of the house, resist its intimidations, refuse its temptations, defy its powers? How can one stand against the gods? One cannot stand against the gods and be serving them at the same time. We must remember that which we most serve, most dwell upon, most rejoice in, and most live for, that which most moves us, draws us, impels us, that which is our greatest joy and ultimate end, that is our God. And if we serve any of the gods, we cannot stand against them. We must renounce any and all gods and any holds they have on our lives. Though in their house, we must not be of their house. We must take no part in their ways, have no communion with their spirits, leave no gap for their entrance, and pay no heed to their commandments. If the age is ruled by the gods and our culture by the spirits, if its leaders are led by them and the majority are impelled by them, then how does one stand? By what power? Only a power strong enough to resist them, and there is only one. There is only one antidote. The Elohim mystery. The only answer to the gods is God. The power of the gods can only be overcome by the power of God. In the Hebrew scripture, the word for God is Elohim. Elohim is plural. It speaks of the one true God in his transcendence and limitlessness. But the same word translated as God is in other contexts translated as the gods, little g. The strange property of the word reveals a profound truth. In the end, it will come down to one Elohim or the other, the Elohim of God or the little e Elohim of the little g gods. We were each created with an emptiness that can only be filled by God's presence. Our hearts possess a God-shaped vacuum, so no matter what else we have, without God, our lives and hearts remain empty. But if we are not filled by Elohim, by God, we will end up being filled by the Elohim, little e, by the gods. The Elohim of the gods manifests in many forms and appearances, whether it's the Elohim of money, success, pleasure, acceptance, self-obsession, addiction, or any other thing. They are, in the end, Elohim, substitutes for the absence of the one who is Elohim, God. We were each made to seek and find him, but if we do not find the Elohim of God, we will end up serving and worshiping the Elohim of the gods. The pagan world was filled with them, but the center of that world was empty, darkened, restless, without peace, purpose, or hope. So the Apostle Paul described the condition of those living in paganism as having no hope and without God in the world. Modern culture, having turned away from God and to the gods, is now marked by the same signs that once marked the ancient pagan world: purposelessness, emptiness, and hopelessness. Look at our younger generation, you guys. You know, I know young people whose biggest concern is that weed be legalized, and I'm just astonished by that. And not that I don't think that it has medicinal properties. I absolutely do. But that is not the most important issue of our day. No one among the gods. The answer is more specific. When the pagan world was set free from its bondage to the gods, it was set free through a specific name, the name of Yeshua, Jesus. The name stood out among the gods. In Hebrew, it means the Lord is salvation. For the pagan world, it meant that there was one God and only one who could actually bring freedom and redemption. Yeshua, Jesus, was unique among the gods in every way. He did not exist in a mythological world of fantasy and imagination, but in real time, in real space, in the flesh and blood realm of historical reality. He did not walk the mythical regions of the underworld, the fields of Elysium, or the halls of Valhalla, but the dry and dusty roads of first-century Judea. The gospel message of his death and resurrection was not based on a recurring mythological cycle, but on the historical accounting of those who witnessed it, and who neither expected it to happen nor understood it when it did, but those whose lives were then radically transformed by it. In his song of praise to God, Moses asked, "Who is like you, O Lord, among the gods?" There had never been one among the gods like Yeshua, Jesus of Nazareth. There had never been one among the gods with a message so wholly centered on so radical a love. There had never been one sage so wholly centered on so radical a love. There had never been one among the gods who told his followers that they were to love even their enemies and forgive those who persecuted them. There had never been one among the gods who was called friend of sinners, nor one who had so loved and reached out to the outcast, the rejected, the broken, and the lost. There had never been one among the gods who could say to the world, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest, and have such words ring true. Nor had there ever been one among the gods who not only spoke of so radical a love, but who actually lived and died as its embodiment. That's good writing. The other altar. Where there were gods, there were altars. The gods demanded sacrifices, even if the sacrifices were the children of their worshippers. Yeshua also had an altar, but there were none among the altars of gods like his altar, nor had any god done what he had done. Instead of demanding that he be given a sacrifice, he alone gave his life as the sacrifice. Instead of taking life, he gave his life, so that life would be given to the world, to all who would receive it. On the first Passover, it is written that the gods of Egypt were brought into judgment, and the people of God were set free from their bondage. It is no accident that the day on which Jesus died was Passover, for it is by that the powers and strongholds of the gods are broken, and by that those who were enslaved and under their bondage are set free. He was the opposite of the gods. He was their antidote. To him belonged the power to cast out the spirits and set free the possessed. It is no accident that it was he who cast out the gods of the pagan world and set free an empire and a civilization that had been possessed and ruled of them. And keep in mind, this is being written by a Jewish rabbi, Messianic Jewish, but the antidote to the gods. The uniqueness of Yeshua, Jesus, was not confined to the ancient world. His influence and impact on the world would exceed and outlast that of every other leader, ruler, power, nation, and empire. He would become the central figure of our planet. Every moment of human history, every event that took place on earth would be marked and dated by its relation to his birth. Even 2,000 years after his coming, even in the modern world, there was still none like him among the gods. There was none so feared and hated by them. He had cast them out of the ancient world, and upon their return, they would wage war against him, against his word and people. And so the persecution against Christians would be greater in the modern world than it had been in the ancient world, greater than in the days of the Roman arenas. But that fact revealed a critical truth. He was in the modern world as much as he had been in the ancient, the only antidote to the gods, the only answer. As it was in the ancient world, so too in the modern, in him alone, was the power to break their chains, pull down their strongholds, nullify their spells and curses, and set their captives free. The infinite answer. As the presence of darkness is dependent on the absence of light, so the power of the gods was and is dependent on the absence of God. It was that absence in the ancient pagan world that allowed them to rule and thrive, and it was that same absence in the apostasy of the modern world that allowed the gods to return. So in order to achieve dominion, the gods had to separate nations, cultures, and civilizations from God, and also individuals. If one is separated from God, one is subject to the gods, to the powers of darkness. But the power of Yeshua, Jesus, is the opposite. It's the power to end separation, to remove everything that had separated us from God, starting with sin, as all have sinned. And a single sin is enough to create an infinite separation from the one who is infinitely good. And an infinite separation requires an infinite answer to bridge the gap. And so only an infinite life and an infinite love, the life and love of God given in Yeshua, in sacrifice on the cross, can fill the gap, end the separation, and bring reconciliation and redemption. And so the gospel message that came into the pagan world was this: by the death of Jesus of Nazareth, there is forgiveness for sin, every sin, redemption for every life, and the ending of every separation from God, And by his resurrection from death, there is restoration of all brokenness, the nullifying of every curse and eternal life for all who will receive it. Gehenna and heaven. The generation of Israelites that followed the gods perished in judgment while sacrificing their children in the valley of Hinnom. In Hebrew, the valley of Hinnom was called Gai Hinnom. The name would become Gehenna. Gehenna is another name for hell. The gods had led them there. The gods led to hell. They are bent on death and destruction. They are the spirits of hell. But the other God is bent on heaven and eternal life. The message of salvation is that Yeshua, Jesus, bore your judgment so that you would never have to. And by that salvation, you are set free from all darkness, all sin, all judgment, and all hell, and given life here and now and forever. Heaven. It is the power to nullify the past, to end the old life, and to begin anew, to be born of God, born of heaven, born again. The true God and how to receive him. There is no life so far from God that his mercy cannot reach it. That's true. There's no sin one has committed that is so great that his forgiveness is not greater still. No bondage, no addiction, no chain so strong that it can withstand his power to break it. No past so defiled, so full of guilt and shame, that his power to redeem it is still not greater, and no darkness so dark that his love is not deeper still. He is the light that drives out all darkness, the hope that overcomes all hopelessness, the grace that washes away all sin, guilt, and shame, and the way that breaks open every wall and barrier and makes possible what was not. His arms are still open and his love is calling. One only has to say yes to receive it, to receive him. How? It's as simple as opening one's heart and life to the love of God, to give him one's sins and burdens, one's all, to receive him into one's life, to let his presence come into one's heart, his light into the darkness, his forgiveness, his cleansing, his word, his peace, his spirit into every part of one's life, to turn away from all darkness, sin, idols, gods, to put one's faith in Yeshua Jesus as one's Lord and Savior, and to begin following him as his disciple all the days of one's life. It's as simple as making him, who is the only Lord, the true Lord of your life, and him, who is the only true God, the true God of your life. Overcoming the world. And so we return to the question, how then is one to live in a civilization that has become a house of spirits? The only way is by the power of God. It is only by his power that one can stand against the gods. It is only by his love that one can overcome all hatred. Only by his grace can one overcome all sin. Only by his hand can one break the chains of all bondage, and only by his light can one overcome the darkness of the age. And no matter how deep the darkness, the evil, or the odds, the light of God will be greater still, for God is far greater than the gods, and in God is the power to overcome the power of the gods, and in his spirit is the power to overcome the spirits of the age. For in the days of the gods, one must never bow one's knee to any idol, any darkness, or any evil. In days of darkness, the light must not waver or weaken, but must grow stronger. And if the dark grows darker still, then the light must shine all the more brightly into it. And those who will not give up will, in the end, prevail. The end of the gods. The gods have returned. They have ascended the thrones of the modern world. They seek to make every knee bow down before them, but their kingdom is false, their authority illegitimate, and their days numbered. Their kingdom will end, and those who have stood for the light, who have lived their lives by the light, and who have believed in, hoped for, and waited for the light, for them the light will come, and in that light they will arise and shine. To them will come the kingdom in which there is no more darkness, no more tears, no more sorrow, and no more death. The gods have returned, but their days will come to an end, and evil will give way to good, falsehood to truth, and the darkness to the breaking of dawn. Then the illusion of the night, its dreams, its nightmares will fade into the waking of the day, and the gods into the brightness of his coming, the coming of him who is the only light and who alone is God. And then this is the epilogue. It is now the day after the finishing of the book. There was to be no epilogue, but something happened on the day the book was completed to change that. Sorry, guys. Voice is going out. But something happened on the day the book was completed to change that, and so I was asked to write something more. The Return of the Gods was finished on June 24th, 2022. Of all the days on which to be completed, it was the day on which perhaps the most dramatic Supreme Court ruling in living memory was handed down. The court overturned Roe v. Wade. The ruling was that made it illegal for abortion to be prohibited in any part of the nation. My previous book, The Harbinger 2, came out in 2020. In the chapter titled The Plague, I wrote of the Jubilee of abortion. In the Bible, the Jubilee was the year of restoration, restitution, redemption, release, freedom, reversing, and undoing. The Jubilee came once every 50 years. Abortion on demand began in America in 1970, the year I was born. Prominent in pioneering abortion on demand was New York. It quickly became the nation's abortion capital. The prophet Jeremiah warned his nation that the shedding of its children's blood would lead to judgment. The death of the little ones would be answered by the death of the generation that had murdered them. One of the ways in which that death would come, according to Jeremiah's prophecy, would be in the form of a plague. The 50th year after New York legalized abortion on demand came to its conclusion in 2020. It was the Jubilean year of abortion's entrance into America. That year, death came to America as it had in ancient times, in the form of plague, and the plague was given the name COVID-19. I would argue that there were a lot of other factors besides the virus itself, or bioweapon, whatever you want to call it. The connections between what happened in 2020 when the plague struck America and what happened in the 70s when America began embracing abortion and what happened in its wake were stunning and eerie. Those connections, which I shared in The Harbinger 2, involved correlations of places, times, and exact dates. In the year of Jubilee, if you took what did not belong to you, that which you took would be taken from you. America had taken life. Now, in the year of Jubilee, life would be taken from America. But there was another year and another mystery. What began in 1970 culminated in 1973, when the Supreme Court ruled on Roe v. Wade and, in effect, made abortion the law of the land. That meant another Jubilee was coming. When was the Jubilean year of the Supreme Court ruling? The 50th year began on January 22nd, 2022, and would last until January 22nd, 2023. In The Harbinger 2, I wrote this concerning the 50th year of abortion in America. The Jubilee was the reversal of what had been done since the last Jubilee. So in the Jubilean year of 2022, what had taken place in 1973, Roe versus Wade, was reversed. What had been done was undone. The Supreme Court of the 50th year had reversed and undone the ruling of the Supreme Court 50 years earlier. The last of the three gods that make up the Dark Trinity is Moloch. He was, as we have seen, the god especially known for child sacrifice, and thus the principality most especially bound to and behind abortion. It was a striking thing that the last revisions needed for the book in the days leading up to the Supreme Court ruling focused on the sacrifices of the god Moloch. The ruling that overturned Roe v. Wade did not end abortion. It did not bring the reign of Moloch to an end, but it did inaugurate a turning back. In many parts of the nation, it would render his altars inoperable or remove them altogether. There were times in ancient Israel's history that the nation was saved from the brink of judgment. It happened in the days of spiritual revival, when the nation turned back to God. The most salient sign of that revival and that turning back was the breaking down or removing of the altars that dotted the land in honor of the gods, specifically the altars of Baal and Moloch. In the wake of the Supreme Court decision of 2022, America would witness, in many of its regions, the removal and breaking of Molech's modern-day altars. Would it be a sign of revival, the beginning of a nation's return to God and its restoration? Or would it be an anomaly over which the nation will further divide as it continues its fall from God? If it is to be the second, then the future is judgment. If it is to be the first, then it must come through prayer, repentance, a true turning back, true change, and true spiritual revival. The changing of laws will, in the end, fail if there is not also the changing of hearts. And the changing of hearts comes from God and through revival. The fact that the return of the gods was completed on the day that the Supreme Court, after 50 years, overturned its ruling on abortion is significant. The book uncovers the gods and their works in our own day. The Supreme Court ruling was a turning back of Moloch. It was an act of life against death. It was a stand against the gods, the breaking down of their altars. And it was a sign to all those who seek to walk in the ways of God and who are called by his name to take encouragement, heart, strength, hope, and courage, and to live unbowed in the face of the gods. It is time to be strong and of good courage. It is time to be bold. It is time to let go of fear and concern and to take a stand against the darkness and for the light. The darkness will end, but the light will be forever. And so, as it is written, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. For greater, much greater is he who is in you than he who is in the world. Jonathan Cahn. What'd you think? That was a good read. We got through it in record time. Not that that was the goal, but, if you drag a book out too long, people lose track and, forget what was read before. Very much regretted being sick with kidney stone. Oh, I have an angry face emoji. That's interesting. Somebody on Facebook is angry. It's okay. You'll get over it. So I want to talk a little bit about that. Amen, says Debbie. Yeah, it was good, wasn't it? So for anybody who's angry, let's talk about that. We never talk about it. We're just like, oh, this person is angry. And then, the abuse begins and we don't have a conversation. And I'm very big about having conversations and being a team builder. That's just one of my gifts. Thank God. If that made you angry, I would, for me, let's be personal. For me, when something really offends me or makes me angry, I examine my own heart. Why is that thing making me angry? Why am I? So for example, I've told you guys about this. There's this guy that is on Tracy Bean's Dark to Light podcast. He's not on the podcast. He's in the comment section. And he does nothing but stir conflict and attack people. And I was really offended, not because of what he said to me, but by things that he had said about Tracy, because I'm nothing if not loyal. And I was like, how dare you? All the work she does, and you have nothing positive to say, nothing of kindness to add. You just want to tell her how awful she is and how Frank should take over her show. And I have nothing against Frank, but that's totally inappropriate. And I was just finding myself getting more and more wound into arguing with this person. And I thought, what is it about me that is making me want to fight this person, to have this verbal back and forth with them? And I thought it's because we all know what that feels like, to have somebody bully you with words. And that was what bothered me about it. It wasn't so much, that they didn't like her or whatever. It was this disregard for her personhood. And so if you listen to the book today and you're angry, I want you to know that there's nothing in it, and nothing in my spirit, certainly, that disregards your personhood. You are a person, you have a right to be loved and respected and treated with kindness, period. Does that mean that you're making the best choices and choices that are most beneficial to you? No, I'm not even doing that. I make choices all the time that aren't in my own benefit. It's no worse than a choice that somebody else makes that's not in their own benefit. You know, there's not a ranking of sin. Um, but, you know, I too struggle with that. And I too struggle with the idea of being corrected or being shown the error of my ways and having to admit that I'm wrong and turn that around. And I think probably the most important thing you can do is look at the fruit of your life. Um, you know, and I know a lot of people will say, well, I'm doing all this activist work for the LGBTQ movement, you know, and that's positive fruit in my life. Well, is it? Is that advocacy work that you're doing? Is that bringing people into the light? And you can argue that it is. You absolutely can, because they feel more accepted, or you know, like they don't have to live in fear or whatever. And I'm not discounting that at all. Um, all I can tell you is that when I look out on what's happening in the streets in the month of June, it's all bondage. I mean, it's all slavery and bondage. Like that is the big thing that they really seem to push is this being dominated and being bound. Um, and that is in no way lifting up someone's spirit. If someone gives themselves over to the gods, what do you see? You see this spirit of confusion, and they don't even realize they've done it. You know, they've believed what they've been told generally, or they're confused, or they're struggling and they're looking for answers and they're not finding them, and so they're looking to the world for answers instead of to God for answers. And so my thinking would be there that, um, other than the person feeling accepted and like they belong, um, what good is it bringing in their life? Like I can make anybody feel accepted and like they belong. That doesn't mean that leads that person down a good path. You know, people who do drugs have a sense of belonging with other people that do drugs. People who are homeless, people who commit crimes, they gather together in groups called gangs, and they have a brotherhood or sisterhood, whatever you want to call it. And yes, they have an acceptance of how they're behaving and what their beliefs are. But is it leading them down a path of light? No, it's not. It's leading them down a path of self-destruction, destruction of others, destruction of property. Um, and so, while yes, I'm glad those people have a sense of belonging, is that sense of belonging bringing light or darkness to their lives, into the world? And that's what we have to look at. So, you know, even in examining and being critical of my own life and the things I say and do, and my own flaws, I really try to question myself and say, okay, is this flaw that I'm engaged in, or this sin that I'm engaged in, is it adding more than momentary indulgence to my life? Is it making me more? Is it making me a bigger person? Is it making me more like God? And the answer is always no. The answer is always, every single time, no. It is a self-indulgence. It is, you know, my attempt at soothing emotions that I don't want to deal with, or that I'm struggling to deal with. So while, yes, I've found a coping mechanism, is it a coping mechanism that's helping me overcome the problem? That's helping me overcome this darkness, or this sense that I don't belong? Is it helping me overcome that? No, me not going out and struggling, you know, to go out and, you know, because I have this social anxiety, me giving into that just creates more of it. It makes me less likely to go out, makes it more likely for me to stay home, makes me more likely to not schedule some kind of get together, and that's one of those that I really, really struggle with. And so I always have to ask myself, yes, you're having some stress about this moment of being social. But by backing out of it, does that anchor get lobbed around my neck, or does it get taken off? And it gets lobbed around my neck every time, because it makes it harder to go out the next time if I don't go out that time. And so this is a struggle I've had for years, and I'm overcoming it. I really am. I'm getting much better. You know, I'm getting to where most days I don't have significant anxiety about somebody coming over and me having to go somewhere. I don't find myself always trying to think of an excuse for why I don't need to go do that thing, why I don't need to leave the house to go do that thing. Oh, I could just order that or whatever. So by not giving into it, I'm defeating it. And, you know, I have friends that are trans. I have friends that are gay. And what I can share without sharing too much is that my friends that are trans are still struggling with all the same problems they were struggling with before they had their surgeries. And that's always so disheartening for them, because they really thought it was going to be the thing that changed everything for them, and then it wasn't. And it's like wherever you go, there you are, and they're still struggling. They're still not feeling connected to themselves. They have this what is that called, where you have that sense of detachment, but they're still struggling with that. My heart goes out to them, because now they have a bunch of medical issues on top of that. And this thing that was promised to them, this surgery that was going to make everything right, didn't. And in fact, it caused a lot more problems that made everything else even harder. And my friends that are gay have just about had enough of all of the trans stuff. I mean, just to be fair, they don't like it. They feel like their movement has been stolen from them. They are now being ostracized by their own movement. You know, they're now being told, you know, if a gay man doesn't want to date a trans man, he's now considered homophobic. And he's like, how did this happen in my own faith, you know, or my own belief system? You know, I am attracted to men. This person would say, I'm attracted to men. And now if I'm not attracted to a trans man, I'm ostracized by my own people group. And that is a sign that this is not from God, that this is destructive, that it's now, you know, it was this thing that was meant to bring people together and help them not be ostracized, which I'm all for, and to allow them to live as the rest of us live, which, you know, you shouldn't be discriminated against based on who you love, period. That's how it was all sold to them, this whole tolerance thing. But what's happening now is their own group has become intolerant of them. There's no room for you. We'll shove you out the door if you don't believe what we believe. And I said this probably 2 years ago. I said, when will BLM and the LGBT movement, when will those two movements realize that they have been taken over by Marxism? When will they realize, when will the BLM movement realize that this Marxist transgender movement has overtaken the civil rights movement of Black Americans? I'm just astounded by it. I'm like, as Black Americans and white Americans who support Black Americans, you know, in their belief systems and in their rights, so many years, so much was lost and given up and overcome, and so much work was done to help liberate people who should have never not been liberated. And then the LGBTQ movement comes, and I'm not so much even blaming the gays or lesbians, just this later faction of it has come in, and it has taken over the Black Lives Matter movement, which has now turned out to be a big money laundering scam. But the movement, you know, the initial thought of it was not that. The initial thought of it was, you know, there's real crisis in the Black community. There's a real problem with crime. There's a real problem with law enforcement. You know, how do we fix these problems? And those are all very real problems. We can't ignore them. Is there institutional racism? Absolutely. I saw it in healthcare all the time. I was amazed at how somebody who, say, was on Medicaid and a white person was treated versus somebody who was a Black person on Medicaid. You know, they were less likely to get education on their illness and their medications. And, you know, there was always this kind of thought and what's funny is all the people screaming institutional racism are all the people doing it. It's not your average person living in your neighborhood. The institutional racism is coming from these places who supposedly are trying to stop it. So, for example, I went to my old orthopedist before I started with this new one, and there's a sign up in the doctor's office that says, this is a Twin Spirits organization. I need to take a picture of it. And we ascribe to equity in healthcare. I don't even know what equity in healthcare is, because every person is an individual, and you cannot apply one standard and make everything equitable, because you're a person that's made differently, that has different health problems, lives in a different the whole thing's just foolishness. But anyway, we can seek to stamp out not treating people properly in healthcare, absolutely, but equity you're not going to get. So anyway, I forgot where I was going with that. Equity. Oh, about systemic racism. So, they put up this sign and they're like, this is our goal to, to provide healthcare in an equitable way. And then it had this Two Spirits thing on it. And I thought, this is Catholic Healthcare Initiatives. This is the company, the overarching company. I don't know what this Two Spirit thing is or where it came from. And I think that's what it's called. I'll have to drive down there and take a picture of that sign. It's a little bit of a drive. But anyway, yes, there is discrimination. There's always going to be discrimination. As long as people are alive, there's going to be thoughts that this person should not be able to have this and this person should. That's just the nature of being human. And so for all of these companies that are, stamping out institutional racism, they're the ones doing it. They're engaged in things that are destructive to people. You look at the whole Bud Light fiasco, right? And, Dylan Mulvaney is neither here nor there in that. I thought it was interesting that the whole point that everybody missed was everybody's mad at a company that makes a substance that is meant to intoxicate you, which is fraught with all kinds of other problems. Now, if you're a person who drinks and doesn't drink to the point of intoxication all the time, that's different. But as we know, that's something that many people struggle with. So this is the thing that everybody's outraged. They're outraged about Dylan Mulvaney. And I'm like, wow, we're not outraged about the deaths that are caused by alcoholism, liver failure, about the accidents that are caused by it, about the violence that is caused in relationship to alcoholism. We're not upset about any of that. We're upset about Dylan Mulvaney. And while I think that Dylan Mulvaney is very confused and is struggling with his own personal self-concept, and he's fleshing out, he's kind of experimenting with different things to sort himself out and to make money and make a name for himself. I mean, he's following all of the little g God things that are not going to result in his ultimate enlightenment or fulfillment. And that's a problem in and of itself. But I just think it's funny that we're boycotting the beer because of Dylan Mulvaney and not boycotting the beer because of all of the destruction that it's caused, or that people who abuse it cause in the world. We don't talk about that. So anyway, that's kind of my take on it. We were supposed to have my friend David on for the 9/11 talk on Friday. But as you know, I had a kidney stone and I was out for the count, or down for the count. So I messaged him, and I need to get back in and look at my emails. I've just been behind where I've just been feeling so bad. But I need to message him and see when we were going to reschedule that, because we were supposed to have done it this last Friday. And so I sent him a message to reschedule. And then we'll start into, once I get his dates, I'll kind of go from there as far as book club. I know we wanted to read some of the children's books, and I've got some children's books in mind that are great reads, which I think will also be nice because this is a time of day when a lot of people are home with their kids, even though most of my audience tends to be older. But I think it'll be good, and it'll be nice to look at children's literature and see what bigger lessons it teaches us. So we'll kind of work all that in. We'll flesh it out. I don't know the exact dates yet, but we'll get there. It is 1:40, so I'm going to close this out with prayer, or I'm not going to have any voice on Friday. And I'll keep you guys posted if anything happens and that stone starts giving me grief on Friday, if I can do my show or not. Hopefully it'll be okay by then. It's definitely lower, so that's good. So let me pray us out. Oh, wait a minute. Hold on. I missed some comments. Lorraine says, it's been hard to hear these truths and concepts of our nation, world, present day reality. The clarity is stark and somewhat painful to digest. It is. It is. And take heart, Lorraine, because I feel that too. I feel like, wow, this is such a mess. Can we even turn it around? Yes, thank you. This is what I would say to you about that, about feeling overwhelmed and like, how can we ever change this? We keep pushing forward. We are the city on a hill. We are the light. We are the salt. And we can't lose that. We cannot cannot give in to hopelessness. And I've read to you some of my writing on that. Hopelessness is one of the worst things that we can fall victim to. And so we must always be looking. You're not going to fix the major problems of the world today. Um, but you could show an act of kindness or mercy to somebody today. You could exercise or engage in an act of unconditional love to somebody. You could bless somebody who's not normally in your path of blessings. And yes, be a David. You love the Lord your God with all of your heart, soul, and your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And in these things, there is no sin. He was pretty much telling us that, yeah, those other 10 commandments are great, but if you just followed these 2, you don't even need the other 10, because you're not going to be able to kill somebody that you're loving as yourself. You're not going to commit adultery with somebody's wife if you're loving that person as yourself. So start there, and the path will become clearer. As things devolve, as you see good arise. If you guys didn't watch, my friend Tracy did the red carpet for, or was one of the people that helped with the red carpet for The Great Awakening, the Plandemic 3 film. And that's on Rumble. Just search The Great Awakening. And that movie is really good. And it talks about where we are and how we've gotten here, how our government has done this to us, how dark forces have done this to us, and how do we start turning that around? How do we be the salt of the earth? How do we become the light of God? Just a little bit every day. This morning I didn't feel good, and I'm like, okay, I don't feel good, but I'm not dying. Before I felt like I was dying, and I'm like, I'm going to get on there. I'm going to read the book as long as I can. I'm going to keep pushing, because this is an important word and people are really struggling, and I love you guys, and I want to be an encouragement in your life. And that's what you can do. That's how you make change in this world. You change your heart. You turn from the things that are destructive to you and turn to God. And God's love and light will flow out of you and get on everyone around you. And they may not know it. They may not accept it at first. But love is an unstoppable force. And that's how we start. That's where we start. Be the hands and feet of Jesus, says Debbie. Exactly. That's really, really important, because so few people are doing it. And don't cave. Don't give in. You don't have to be combative. But like my granddaughter said to me the other day, I said, my other granddaughter had hurt her finger. And I said, oh, Sophie, I hate that you hurt your finger. And my older granddaughter said to me, don't use the word hate. We don't use the word hate. You have to use a different word like detest or loathe, or she's 8, And I said, well, first of all, I'm grown, so you don't get to tell me what words I can and can't use. And what does the word detest mean? And she's like, well, to dislike immensely. And I'm like, what does dislike immensely mean? Well, that means to loathe. And what does loathe mean? It means to hate. And I said, it is not okay to say you hate a person, but you can hate something that's going on. So Sophie hurt her finger, and I hate that she is suffering pain and that she suffered that injury. That's an appropriate use of that word. So I didn't have to jump on her and, don't you tell me what I can and can't say. I'm a grown woman. No, that's an opportunity to educate. And she accepted that and didn't question it. And, she'll mow on that as she grows up. And hopefully I can plant those little seeds, because I can see where, like we were over there watching a movie one time, and we were watching E.T., and I called E.T. it, and she got on me for misgendering E.T. And I'm like, okay, first of all, this is a movie. Second of all, can you tell me what gender E.T. is? Has E.T. told us what gender he is? I think it's fine. It's an alien. But it's to that point that she was worried about me misgendering a fictitious alien, So it must be going on pretty strong in the schools and everything for her to seize on that. And so I'm trying to be very gentle and very kind, and just shine the light for her and show her where that's flawed thinking. And that's what we do. You're not going to convince everybody, but you can shine just a little light. Everybody can do that. It was a great movie, great team behind it. Tracy did a great job on the carpet. I've not really got to debrief with her since then, because she's been busy and I've been sick. But I'll be doing that, and she's going to be coming on the show. So Tracy, I invited her to come to a Friday night with us, and I believe she's going to be doing that. I'll have to get a date from her. But anyway, um, be love, be the hands and feet of Jesus, show kindness, show mercy, be empathetic, but don't don't walk away from your beliefs and what you know is right. And you can do that in love. Jesus did it his entire life. They were going to murder him, and he knew they were going to murder him, and he still acted with love. It wasn't easy. It's a high calling, but we're called to do it. Okay. All right. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this morning, and thank you for keeping things quiet long enough for me to finish the book with my kidney. And I just would pray and thank you for everybody who does pray for my healing, and that thing would drop out of there and we'd be able to avoid those in the future, because they're pretty dang awful. And I just thank you that the other two have moved on, and I'm not still struggling with those. And Father, I just want to pray for everybody that's here. I don't, it sounds so weird to say, um, but I have this sense of the room, be it as it were, this is a big room, but I have this sense that in the room that people are really feeling hopeless. That we're not ever going to win a battle. We're not ever going to, the courts are never going to stand up for what's right. Um, and that we're just going to keep having all of this shoved down our throats. And I'm guilty of feeling that way myself too, Lord. And I know it's so hard because, we're so attached to this world, and we see this as the only reality. And we forget that there's a reality beyond this, where you've already won this battle. You've already fought this fight. You've already walked this darkness. And all you ask us to do is just be faithful, and you will fight for us, and be willing to go into the fight, and to be the light of the world. And Father, we just thank you that you would even partner with us in that. Who am I that you would use me to change the lives of people? I'm just a normal, everyday person. And so is everyone else that's here. And I just thank you for all these normal, everyday people who consistently are trying to be the light. We fall short, and we ask for your forgiveness in that. Father, most of all, we ask you to forgive us for sin, for things that we're struggling with that we know are not making us more. They're holding us in place, or they're setting us back. And I pray that you would show that to us, that these things that we think that we're giving into that seem like very small things, and like no one can see, and like there's no impact on us. Show us the impact that has on us and the people around us. Help us see that. Help us know that when we're engaging in these small sinful things, that we are struggling with the same thing everybody else is struggling with as far as sin. We're no better, no worse, but we need your forgiveness. And Father, we just thank you for Yeshua, for your son Jesus, this walking, living, breathing example of how to exist in a time of great conflict and great darkness. And that the Bible, Jesus's walk is just populated with love and light, and his interactions with children and with God, and that somehow he found a way to be optimistic and hopeful, knowing what he was facing. And just out of incredible love for us, he wept in the garden that night. He knew what was going to happen to him. Jesus wept. And I always thought, okay, he's weeping because he's going to the cross, and that is the most horrible thing. But maybe he was weeping for us that night. Maybe that was part of it. Maybe he was weeping for all the things that we would go through and that we would struggle with, and grieving those. And, the resolution of his prayer that night was that he knew what he was going to do. He knew what his path was, that God was not going to take that away, and he was going to drink from that cup because of his great love for us, and because of his compassion for us that night, for everything that he knew he would go through. And I just thank you for that. And Father, for everybody who's struggled with church and, is pushing God away because they're equivocating God with church, let them know, fill them, let them feel you with your love. Let them know that you are a living, breathing God, and that you want relationship with them, and that a church hurt can't get in the way of that. And grow them spiritually, and grow them in their character and in their belief, so that they are able to go into a church and be the light to people there who are not walking the path and who are hurting other Christians. Father, we just thank you for sending us your son and for your love for us to do that. And we thank you for all of the people that come to this podcast. I thank you for everybody that's here, everybody who donates, Father. Please return that blessing to them tenfold, pressed down, shaken together, running over for contributing to the work of your kingdom. And it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, guys, got a little weepy on that one. But good stuff. I will see you guys Friday night, barring anything. I don't know what the deal is with the bangs. Am I cutting them wrong? Maybe I'm cutting them wrong. I have not had a haircut in, I don't know, a really not a professional one. I as you can tell, I do it myself. I just can't see paying $35 to have my hair trimmed, and it doesn't grow anyway. This is as long. I mean, it doesn't. That's as long as it gets. I don't know why. I don't know what I've done. That if I didn't cut my hair for 20 years, other than my bangs, this would still be just to there. Yeah, it is what it is, right? Anyway, I love you guys, whole big bunches. Thank you for being patient with me while I was sick. Thank you to the people who've sent prayers and texts and donations, and it's all just so helpful to us. And it's nice that we're starting to get at a point with donations where they're almost covering costs, so that I'm not spending money to do the podcasts. That's ultimately the goal, is that it wouldn't cost me anything to do it, and take out of our budget to do it. But I will keep being faithful until that point and beyond. So I will see you guys Friday night at 8:30, and again on Tuesday, and I'll have some schedule updates on people that are coming on sometime between now and then. So love you, whole big bunches. You guys take care of yourselves, take care of each other. Nurse Penny out.